length about on One Step Beyond, the show that usually occupies roughly this time slot. It really, just through pure serendipity, has dovetailed very nicely with what's going on the national scene. One of the outcroppings, and of course at this point one of the angles that's most hushed up about the Iran/Contra affair is the involvement of the Contras in running drugs to support their, quote, revolutionary effort, unquote, and besides the Contras, the American intelligence establishment and military establishments themselves being involved in the dealing of drugs, and the drugs for weapons for political power circle that goes all the way through North and South America, as well as a lot of other places, of course, but for our purposes tonight and our purposes in the Contra scandal, primarily we're interested in the North, South, and Central American links. So this is extremely timely. We talked several weeks ago about the fact that the Kerry Commission, among others, Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts, are apparently hard at work trying to break the facade of the Contra cocaine dealing scam. Again, a particularly interesting thing to know about at the time when we're being hammered with a, quote, just say no mentality. We're being told that if we were good citizens, we wouldn't mind submitting to urinalysis and things of this nature to protect our jobs, our livelihoods. Just recently, the scheme has gone through for federal employees. It's currently being held up in court, but the Federal Employees Union is not objecting on moral grounds. They're objecting on very specific grounds about the efficacy of the tests and things of that nature. So it's very important to all citizens to realize, on one hand, while the government with one hand is holding the bottle underneath you or before you, on the other hand, the government also seems to be dealing smack in cocaine right and left, and it's very important to understand how this developed and what purpose it serves in today's political milieu.
Now, the first of our broadcasts in Radio Free, that is to say, the first of our archive shows specifically about this subject, we documented how the U.S. intelligence services, the CIA in particular, gave rise in considerable measure to the international heroin trade in the post-World War II era by employing many of its primary elements, such as the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, the Union Corse of the organized crime syndicate of Corsica and Marseille, in an anti-communist capacity, and the further alliance between the U.S. national security establishment and various elements of the Kuomintang, which had been using the opium traffic to finance political reaction in Asia for quite some time. The dovetailing of those organizations in many ways led to the booming of the post-World War II heroin trade. In our second broadcast, we documented the close interrelationship between the international arms trade, our intelligence services, and the international drug trade. In the last broadcast on this subject, we began going into in fact we did cover, among other things, the use of elements of the Federal Narcotics Prevention Force to, in fact, selectively enforce who is going to be trafficking in the major narcotics areas, specifically heroin. We took a look at how the DEA and a special White House assassination team to be used supposedly to clean up the international drug trade was in fact used to muscle the Corsicans out of the trade in favor of a number of organized crime syndicates, primarily mafia in this country, which were very close to Richard Nixon. We also took a look during the course of that last broadcast at the dovetailing, and also to a certain extent in the Radio Free America number 25, at the dovetailing of many of these international drug smuggling syndicates with not only our own intelligence system, but also with right-wing terror, in particular CIA and U.S. national security establishment-sponsored terror in Latin America. That's where we're going to be picking up again this evening. The broadcast this evening could very appropriately be titled as it could be titled with the subtitle of a book which we're going to rely on in considerable measure on this broadcast as we have in others. The book is called The Great Heroin Coup, subtitled Drugs, Intelligence, and International Fascism. It was authored by freelance Danish journalist Henrik Kruger, Kruger, with a foreword by Peter Dale Scott, published in softcover by the South End Press, and copyrighted 1980. And the broadcast this evening, which will rely in considerable measure on the Great Heroin Coup, could very well be titled Drugs, Intelligence, and International Fascism. In fact, probably at Davcore, that's exactly what it'll be titled. And what we're going to be talking about this evening is the triad of the U.S. national security establishment, the CIA in particular, the narcotics trafficking elements that we've spoken of in the past, and right-wing terror, in particular right-wing terror in Latin America.
All right, starting out with tonight's rather, as Dave said, rather extensive selections from the Great Heroin Coup by Heinrich Krüger. Meyer Lansky, the syndicate's financial wizard and its chairman from around 1947, began building his Cuban empire in the early 40s. When free elections chased his close friend and dictator Fulgencio Batista from office in 1944, Lansky also left the island, entrusting his empire to the Trafficante family headed by Santo Sr. Lansky and Batista settled in Hollywood, Florida, just north of Miami. Before long, Lansky was running an illegal casino empire on the coast, and in 1947 he eliminated Bugsy Siegel and moved into Las Vegas. All the while, Lansky expanded the narcotics trade founded by Lucky Luciano. The older mafia dons deemed the trade taboo, so Lansky's wing of the syndicate cornered the market, with Trafficante's eldest son, Santo Jr., overseeing the heroin traffic. When Florida's illegal casinos were shut down in 1950, Lansky promoted Batista's return to power in Cuba. The drive bore fruit in 1952. With Trafficante Sr.'s death in 1954, Santo Jr. became Lansky's right-hand man and manager of his Cuban interests. Until then, he had managed the Sans Souci Casino, a base for running Havana's tourist trade and keeping tabs on heroin shipments from Marseille to New York via Florida and Cuba. Trafficante Jr. has proven more talented than his father. Extraordinarily intelligent and energetic, he has handled the most acute crises with detached calm. Luciano characterized him as, quote, a guy who always managed to hug the background, but he is rough and reliable. In fact, he's one of the few guys in the whole country that Meyer Lansky would never tangle with. In no time, Trafficante Jr. ingratiated himself with dictator Batista while remaining loyal to Lansky, who appointed him manager of his own Florida interests in addition to those in Cuba. Lansky needed to spend increasing amounts of time in New York between travels to Las Vegas, Rome, Marseille, Beirut, and Geneva. Many envied Lansky's ever-increasing power and wealth, among them Murder, Inc. chairman of the board, Albert Anastasia. In 1957, the latter tried enlisting Trafficante's aid in removing Lansky from the Havana scene. It was one of Anastasia's last moves. Trafficante arranged a, quote, friendly meeting in New York's Sheraton Hotel. An hour after Trafficante had checked out, Anastasia was murdered in the hotel's barber shop, shaving cream still on his face. According to Peter Dale Scott, quote, certain U.S. business interests collaborated with the narcotics-linked American mafia in Cuba, as they did with similar networks in China and later in Vietnam, for the mafia supplied the necessary local intelligence, cash, and muscle against the threat of communist takeover, unquote. As Scott wrote those words in 1973, Cuban Americans recruited by the CIA were suspected by federal and city authorities to be, quote, involved in everything from narcotics to extortion rackets and bombings, unquote. The Church Committee and other Senate and law enforcement reports would confirm these allegations. Again, we observe the Cuba, Southeast Asia, CIA triangle, and it's no secret who managed the Cuban side. There, Trafficante Jr. hired the fast-learning natives, while dictator Batista's men made the empire safe for organized crime, often appearing more loyal to Trafficante than to Batista himself. In return, the Cubans learned the business.
With Fidel Castro's January 1, 1959 ouster of Batista, Lansky and Trafficante were in trouble. Though they were expelled from their Cuban kingdom, nearly a year elapsed before the syndicate departed and the casinos were closed. Along with Trafficante and Lansky, 500,000 Cubans left the island in the years following Castro's takeover. Some 100,000 settled in the New York City area, especially Manhattan's Washington Heights and New Jersey's Hudson County. Another 100,000 headed to Spain, others to Latin America, and 250,000 made their new home in Florida, the site of Trafficante's new headquarters. Out of the Trafficante-trained corps of Cuban officers, security staffers, and politicians, a Cuban mafia emerged under the mobsters' control. It specialized in narcotics, first Latin American cocaine, then Marseille heroin. With his Cubans, Trafficante also grabbed control of La Bolita, the numbers game that took Florida by storm and became a syndicate gold mine. Besides the Cubans, who comprised the main wing of his organization, Trafficante also worked closely with the non-Italian Harlan Blackburn mob, a break with mafia tradition. But the core of the Trafficante family remained Italian, and the Italians also dealt in drugs. In 1960, his man Benedito Benny the Cringe Indiviglio, Indiviglio, negotiated the opening of a narcotics route with Jacques l'Américain, the representative of Corsican boss Joseph Orsini. Benedetto and his brothers Romano, Arnold, Charles, and Frederick eventually ran Trafficante's Montreal-bound smuggling network and were later joined by the notorious New York wholesaler Louis Cirillo. Trafficante settled in Tampa, but continued to run some of his activities from Jimmy Hoffa's Teamster Local 320 in Miami. Trafficante and David Yaris of Sam Giancana's Chicago mob were instrumental in founding Local 320, which, according to the McClellan hearings, was a front for syndicate narcotics activities. After losing his Havana paradise, far-sighted Meyer Lansky used straw men to buy up much of Grand Bahama Island and erected a new gambling center around the city of Nassau. But though Lansky and Trafficante each survived in style, neither they nor the Cuban exiles relinquished hope of a return to Cuba. Moreover, they were not alone in dreaming of overthrowing Castro. The CIA in particular let its imagination run wild to this end. Its covert operations expert, General Edward Lansdale, seriously planned to send a submarine to the shore outside Havana where it would create an inferno of light. At the same time, Cuba-based agents would warn the religious natives of the second coming of Christ and the Savior's distaste for Fidel Castro. However, elimination by illumination, unquote, was shelved in favor of less fantastic suggestions for Castro's assassination. The latter brought together the CIA, Cuban exiles, and the syndicate in the person of Santo Trafficante.
Continuing with Henrik Kruger's The Great Heroin Coup. In 1960, the CIA asked its contract agent Robert Mayhew to contact the mobster John Rosselli. Rosselli introduced Mayhew to Trafficante and Sam Giancana, the Chicago capo, and the strange bedfellows arranged an attempt on the life of Castro. The agency had previously stationed an agent on Cuba who was to flash the green light when assassination opportunities arose. He was Frank Angelo Fiorini, a one-time smuggler of weapons to Castro's Revolutionary Army, to whom Castro had entrusted the liquidation of the gambling casinos. Through the later assignment, Fiorini had made the acquaintance of Trafficante. In February 1961, Trafficante and Rosselli met at Miami's Fontainebleau Hotel. There, Mayhew gave the hoods untraceable poison capsules for delivery to a Cuban exile connected with the Trafficante mob. Other Cubans were to smuggle them to the island and poison Castro. But the attempt failed. Trafficante engineered more attempts, including one in September 1962, and his organization also provided Cubans for the Bay of Pigs invasion. Never before had there existed a more remarkable, fanatical group of conspirators than that assembled to create, finance, and train the Bay of Pigs invasion force. The top CIA figures were Lansdale protege Napoleon Valeriano, the mysterious Frank Bender, and E. Howard Hunt, who was himself involved in at least one of the attempts on Fidel Castro's life. They were supported by a small army of CIA operatives from 4 of its Miami cover firms. By the way, we should just mention the Frank Fiorini mentioned earlier is Frank Sturgis, later known of Watergate fame and also a close working companion of E. Howard Hunt in many other operations. Runner-up to Hunt for the most intriguing CIA conspirator award is Bender, a German refugee whose true identity remains a matter of speculation. Some contend that he had been an agent of the West German Gehlen espionage network under the name Drecker, D-R-E-C-H-E-R. Others contend it was Droller, D-R-O-L-L-E-R. The former security chief for Dominican Republic dictator Rafael Trujillo claims that Bender was in fact one Fritz Schwend, or they spell it here S-W-E-N-T, Svend, a Gehlen collaborator and leader of ex-Nazis in Peru. Prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion, Svend was allegedly the CIA's man in the Dominican Republic as Don Frederico. There he purportedly planned the invasion along with mobster Frank Costello and ex-Cuban dictator Batista. Okay, before we get back to that, let me just run back over that name before we finish up this section. Okay, this man is going to be very important in our broadcast tonight. Fritz or Freddy Svend or Schwend. It's either spelled, last name either spelled S-W-E-N-D or S-C-H-W-E-N-D. Fritz or Freddy Schwend, also known as Don Federico, a Galen collaborator and a leader of the ex-Nazis in Peru. He's going to loom very important in our broadcast tonight. Among other things he was involved in was the rat line, using the proceeds, the profits from the counterfeiting Operation Bernhardt, the SS operation, to finance the rat line to get Nazis out of Europe. Also, the Vatican and the CIA, the Vatican and military intelligence helped out with that one. So Freddy Schwend, presumably also a.k.a. Frank Bender, one of the planners of the Bay of Pigs operation.
We went into Frederick Schwend, his association with the CIA, the Rat Line, and Klaus Barbie in Radio Free America number 19, the third of our programs about the Vatican politics, the P2 Lodge, and the assassination of Pope John Paul II.
The invasion's moral and financial supporters included many leading China lobbyists. Most important was the multimillionaire behind Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers, William Pawley, P-A-W-L-E-Y. Pawley had been involved in the CIA's 1954 overthrow of Guatemala's democratically elected Arbenz regime. Like Lansky and Traficante, Pawley had a big stake in Cuba. Prior to Castro's takeover, he had owned the Havana bus system and sugar refineries. He met with President Eisenhower several times in 1959 to persuade the president to assist Cuban exiles in overthrowing Castro. Pawley then helped the CIA recruit anti-Castro Cubans. It should be mentioned a couple of other key players in the 1954 Guatemalan coup that overthrew the Arbenz regime. Not only the aforementioned E. Howard Hunt, but one of the pilots involved in training people for the 1954 coup in Guatemala was a man by the name of David Ferry, who, according to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, was the first man that should be looked at in reopening an investigation into a conspiracy in the John F. Kennedy assassination. David Ferry, of course, not being around to be looked at in the flesh after a mysterious accident took his life. But one of the most important and strange people in American political history, also involved in that 1954 Guatemalan operation, and the contact here, not only between the Mafia and the CIA, but then the CIA and the anti-Castro Cubans, is going to form a thread not only running through all our drug stuff tonight, but it runs directly from Guatemala to Cuba to the Kennedy assassination to Watergate and right on up into the Contra scam today.
And also through the other assassinations as well. We took a look at a fellow named Jack Youngblood, his cooperation with Frank Fiorini, a.k.a. Frank Sturgis, and in turn Jack Youngblood's probable subsequent involvement in the assassination of Martin Luther King. Continuing now with Henry Kruger's account of the triad of the CIA, right-wing terror, and organized crime involving the narcotics traffic, and eventually, as we're going to look at this evening, a series of right-wing terrorist operations in Latin America. The key Cuban exile conspirators in the Bay of Pigs operation and the ensuing attacks on Cuba and Castro included Manuel Artime, Orlando Bosch — Bosch is an important character, we're going to come back to him — Felipe de Diego, and Rolando Martinez, the first a close friend of Howard Hunt's, the last two future Watergate burglars. The name of Bosch, B-O-S-C-H, was to become synonymous with terrorism. Distinguishing the non-criminal element among the Bay of Pigs anti-Castro Cubans is no easy matter, since so many emerged from Traficante's Cuban Mafia. According to agents of the BNDD, that was the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, a predecessor of the DEA, beginning again, according to agents of the BNDD, nearly 10% of the 1,500-man force had been or eventually were arrested for narcotics violations. Its recruiters included syndicate gangsters like Richard Kane, the former Chicago policeman who became a lieutenant for Sam Giancana. The Dominican Republic, a focal point in the invasion scheme, also became a transit point for Traficante's narcotics traffic. Furthermore, the CIA, according to agents of the BNDD, helped organize the drug route by providing IDs and speedboats to former Batista officers in the Dominican Republic in charge of narcotics shipments to Florida. It is of paramount importance to note the close CIA cooperation with Traficante's Cuban Mafia, whose overriding source of income was the smuggling of drugs. One of Traficante's personal CIA contacts for the Bay of Pigs was Frank Fiorini, Castro's liquidator of mob casinos, who now preferred the name Frank Sturgis. In late 1960, Sturgis ran the Miami-based International Anti-Communist Brigade, IACB, said to be financed by the syndicate. According to Richard Whatley, W-H-A-T-T-L-E-Y, a brigade member hired for the invasion, quote, Trafficante would order Sturgis to move his men, and he'd do it. Our ultimate conclusion was that Trafficante was our backer. He was our money man, unquote. Another detail from Sturgis's past is especially interesting in light of Frank Bender's alleged ties to the Galen organization. For a period in the early 50s, Sturgis was involved in espionage activities in Berlin, serving as a courier between various nations' intelligence agencies, and was thereby inevitably in contact with the Galen network. The Bay of Pigs invasion was, of course, a fiasco, but that hardly stopped the CIA, the syndicate, or their Cuban exile troops. Wheels were soon turning on new assassination attempts under CIA agent William Harvey, who again collaborated with the underworld. Within months, the Miami CIA station JM Wave was again in full swing. It sponsored a series of hit-and-run attacks on strategic Cuban targets that spanned 3 years and involved greater manpower and expenditures than the Bay of Pigs invasion itself.
Continuing. To head the JM Wave station, the CIA chose one of its up-and-coming agents, the 34-year-old Theodore Shackley, who came direct from Berlin. His closest Cuban exile associates were Joaquin Sangenis and Rolando Watergate Burglary Martinez. Some 300 agents and 4,000 to 6,000 Cuban exile operatives took part in the actions of JM Wave. As later revealed, one of its last operations was closed down because one of its aircraft was caught smuggling narcotics into the United States. Okay, now pay special attention to the part coming up, because Theodore Shackley, not only involved in several of the things we talked about, came up in our assassination attempt on the Pope series, but of course he is now one of the key players in the current Contra/Iran scam.
He is also one of the major members of the Turbo Wilson team, which has come back into focus in a big way during the Iran-Contra Gate scam. Edwin Wilson himself was a paymaster for the Bay of Pigs. We also looked at Theodore Shackley in Radio Free America number 12, where we analyzed what we referred to as the Cuban Freikorps, basically an underground extension of the military put together by JM Wave and apparently involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. And we're going to be repeating in this broadcast certain sections from that program, and we're taking a look in particular now at the organized crime narcotic smuggling elements of the Cuban Freikorps.
Continuing, Theodore Shackley is another contender for the Most Intriguing CIA Conspirator Award. After years of collaboration with Trafficante organization Cubans, he and part of his Miami staff were transferred to Laos, where he joined Lucien Conein, C-O-N-E-I-N. There they helped organize the CIA's secret Mayo Tribesman Army, the second such army drummed up by Shackley that was up to its ears in the drug traffic. Vientiane, where Shackley was the station chief, became the new center of the heroin trade. For those of you who don't know, of course, Vientiane is the capital of Laos. Later, he ran the station in Saigon, where the traffic flowed under the profiteering administration of Premier Nguyen Cao Ky. When the agency prepared its coup against the Chilean President Salvador Allende, Shackley was its chief of covert operations in the Western Hemisphere. When William Colby became the director of the CIA in 1973, Shackley took over his job as chief of covert operations in the Far East. Eventually, he was booted out of the agency as part of the shakeup ordered by its current director, Stansfield Turner. By the way, one of the reasons that supposedly, and this is all rather unclear still, but one of the reasons, of course, that he was supposedly booted out of the agency was because he was caught in part of the Ed Wilson, Frank Turple weapons shipment scams that, of course, many people since then, Dave and myself included, have suggested were not, in fact, extra-legal at all. Well, it might have been extra-legal, but they were not extra agency. They were, in fact, part of the agency's policy, and that throwing them out of the agency never stopped their actual involvement with agency plans. Stansfield Turner, I don't know, he may have thought that that's what he was doing, but in practice he proves to have been either naive or just plain wrong or a liar, one of the three. Anyway, continuing now with Shackley and what happened to Shackley and the JM Wave operation. In the JM Wave period, a great expansion in China lobby Trafficante Cuban exile CIA connections occurred. William Pauly financed a mysterious summer 1963 boat raid against Cuba in his own yacht, the Flying Tiger II. Besides Pauly himself, the crew included mafioso John Martino, who had operated roulette wheels in one of Traficante's Havana casinos, CIA agents codenamed Rip, Mike, and Ken, ubiquitous Rolando Martinez, and a dozen other Cuban exiles led by Eddie Bayo and Eduardo Perez, many of whom eventually disappeared mysteriously. Loren Hall, L-O-R-E-N, Loren Hall, another former Traficante casino employee, claimed that both his boss and Sam Giancana had helped plan the raid. Claire Booth Luce, a queenpin of the China lobby, testified during Senate hearings on the CIA that she had financed an exile gunboat raid on Cuba after JFK had ordered the agency to halt such raids. Now, you remember we talked about very briefly about how these threads extend out in every single direction. Loren Hall, mentioned here, is one of the people who was a former Traficante casino employee, also has a rather interesting history, and he's come up in previous One Step Beyond in Radio Free Americas.
Specifically in the aforementioned Radio Free America number 12, dealing with the Cuban Freikorps and its role in the assassination of President Kennedy and its connections to the Aryan Nations neo-Nazi umbrella group up in Hayden Lake, Idaho. We talked about Loren Hall, we talked about the Cuban Freikorps, and specifically we talked about Loren Hall's connections with Edgar Eugene Bradley. We talked about how Loren Hall was interviewed by then Reagan legal counselor Edwin Meese, currently the Attorney General of the United States. And it's interesting, too, that in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy, in our last Radio Free America show, we talked about an organized crime and narcotic smuggling group called The Company, quote-unquote, which appears to have quite possibly have had some intersections with the company, quote-unquote, namely the CIA. Specifically, we took a look at allegations by one of the hitmen used to a man named Charles Harrelson, used to assassinate a federal judge in Texas. That said, we looked at his claim to have been one of the hitmen in the assassination of President Kennedy. We also took a look at an interesting series of connections connecting Charles Harrelson with, among others, Jack Ruby and organized crime figures associated with Santos Traficante. We also, by the way, dealt with Santos Traficante in Guns of November program number 1, and we're going to reprise some of the information, not specifically, but some of the organized crime connections to the Kennedy assassination are going to come into focus here in just a second. The real key element here, though, is Station JM Wave, which, as former CIA agent Ray Klein said, was basically run like a covert operation abroad, although it was based in the United States. JM Wave was basically used to unite a lot of far right-wing elements and to bring them under the umbrella of the U.S. national security establishment. It's worth noting here, too, as we talk about some of the Galen connections, and the Galen and World Anti-Communist League connections we're going to be coming into later, that Theodore Shackley went to the station JM Wave directly from Berlin, and we know what was going on there at this period of time. Continuing now with Henry Kruger's The Great Heroin Coup. I will not wander deeply into the quagmire of circumstances surrounding the murder of President John F. Kennedy. However, it is worth repeating a few lines from the final report of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Quote, "The committee's extensive investigation led to the conclusion that the most likely family bosses of organized crime to have participated in such a unilateral assassination plan were Carlos Marcello and Santo Traficante," unquote. Of the many connections between Traficante and Dallas, the most important are his association with Jack Ruby, who visited him in a Havana prison in 1959. His statement to Cuban exile financier Jose Aleman that Kennedy, quote, "is going to be hit," unquote, and his close association with fellow mafia capo Carlos Marcello. The Cuban exiles, drug racketeers, and the CIA had no shortage of anti-Kennedy motives, which were all the more intensified as the three forces gradually welded together. The anti-Cuba actions continued well into 1965, at which time a crucial three-year turnabout for the Lansky Syndicate began. Its money had been invested in the unsuccessful attempt at toppling Castro, and in its new casino complex in Nassau, which was threatened by local anti-gambling forces. So when Southeast Asia began emerging as a new heroin export center, Lansky sent his financial expert John Pullman to check out the opportunities for investment. Close on his heels went Frank Furci, F-U-R-C-I, the son of a Traficante lieutenant. From 1968 on, Traficante's Cubans were in effective control of the traffic in heroin and cocaine throughout the United States. The Florida Capo's only gangland partner of significance was the Catroni family in Montreal. Trafficante carried out his business in a cool and collected manner. Never out of line with the national syndicate, he enjoyed relative anonymity while other, less prominent gangsters wrote their names in history with blood. His organization was so airtight that when narcotics investigators finally realized how big a fish he was, they had to admit he was untouchable. The BNDD tried nabbing him in its 1969-70 Operation Eagle, then the most extensive action ever directed against a single narcotics network. The Bureau arrested over 120 traffickers, wholesalers, and pushers, but made no real dent. Within days, well-trained Cubans moved into the vacated slots.
To the BNDD's surprise, a very large number of those arrested in Operation Eagle were CIA-trained veterans of the Bay of Pigs and Operation 40. Among them were Juan Cesar Restoy, R-E-S-T-O-Y, a former Cuban senator under Batista, Alan Eric Rudd Marrero, last name Rudd-Marrero, a pilot, and Mario Escandar. Their fates were most unusual. Escandar and Restoy, alleged leaders of the narcotics network, were arrested in June 1970, but fled from Miami City Jail in August. Escandar turned himself in, but was released soon afterward when it was established that Attorney General John Mitchell had neglected to sign the authorization for the wiretap that incriminated Escandar. He returned to narcotics and was arrested in 1978 for kidnapping, a crime punishable by life, but for which he got only 6 months. As this work went to press, the FBI was investigating Escandar's relationship with the Dade County, Miami police force. Juan Restoy, on the other hand, turned to blackmail. He threatened to expose a close friend of President Nixon's as a narcotics trafficker, if not given his freedom, and $350,000. Restoy was shot and killed by narcotics agents, as was Rudd Marrero. In late 1970, in the wake of Operation Eagle, Bay of Pigs veteran Guillermo Hernandez Cartaya set up the World Finance Corporation, WFC, a large company alleged to be a conduit for Trafficante investments and for the income from his narcotics activities. Duny Perez Alamo, a CIA-trained explosives expert involved with several Cuban exile terrorist groups, was a building manager for the WFC. Juan Romanach, R-O-M-A-N-A-C-H, a close Trafficante associate, was a WFC bank director. As Hank Messick put it, Hank Messick, by the way, is a writer who wrote a very good book called Of Grass and Snow, and a lot of the stuff that Henrik Kruger is talking about here came up originally in that book.
Also, a very good book called Lansky, detailing Meyer Lansky, and among other things, Lansky's close association with Richard Nixon. In our last Radio Free America show, we talked about we read a chapter from the Great Heroin Coup called The Friends of Richard Nixon, which documented in rather compelling fashion the massive intersection between the Nixon presidency, well, in fact, the Nixon organization throughout the course of Richard Nixon's political career, and many of the organized crime and national security elements which are coming into focus in the present discussion.
Here's Hank Messick talking about the chain of connection here, the chain of personal friendship or business relationship. Hank Messick says, quote, Escandar, of course, was a friend of Hernandez Cartaya, who was a friend of Dick Fincher, who was a friend of Bebe Rebozo, who was a friend of Richard Nixon, who once told John Dean he could get $1 million in cash, unquote. In 1968, Trafficante himself went on an extended business trip to the Far East, beginning in Hong Kong, where he had located his emissary, Frank Furtzi. After a slow 1965-66 start, Furtzi had made great headway. Through his own Meridem Limited, he had cornered the market on Saigon's night spots, catering to GIs. He even ran officer and soldier mess halls, and he had set up a chain of heroin labs in Hong Kong to serve the GI market. From Hong Kong, Trafficante journeyed to Saigon, registering at the Continental Palace Hotel, owned by the Corsican Franchini family. His last stop was Singapore, where he contacted a branch of the splintered Chinese mafia.
Several doors had to be opened to gain access to the opium treasure. The first led to the CIA-controlled Taiwan regime, the second to the Golden Triangle's Kuomintang Chinese and Laotian Mao tribesmen. The latter door had already been opened by the CIA. So, by the way, had the former, as we looked at in Radio Free America number 24. Continuing now with Kruger's account. Still another led to the Triads, Chinese gangster organizations in Hong Kong. Trafficante opened that door with the help of Furci, F-U-R-C-I, who gave him access to Southeast Asia's overseas Chinese. There was no way around the nationalist Chinese suppliers and middlemen. The world had long been told that the narcotics came from Red China, but the facts belied that propaganda claim. Trafficante liked what he saw in his Southeast Asian tour. With enough trained chemists, his mob could be supplied with heroin at a fraction of what it was then paying out to the Corsicans. But first, the smuggling networks had to be worked out, and the Corsicans had to be eliminated. So Santo Trafficante began his war against the Corsicans. His major foe, Auguste Ricord in Paraguay, wasn't about to roll over and die. Ricord got hold of his own Hong Kong connection, Ng Sik Ho, Ng-Sik-Ho, also known as Limpy Ho, a major Chinese nationalist heroin smuggler well connected to the Taiwan regime. After Ricord's emissaries had traveled twice in 1970 to Japan, where they met with Mr. Ho, heroin shipments began going to Paraguay via, among other transit points, Chile. When in 1972 Ricord was extradited to the U.S., Limpy Ho tried establishing his own smuggling route to the U.S. via Vancouver. But that failed when two of his lieutenants, Sammy Cho and Chang Yu Ching, were arrested in the U.S. with 50 pounds of pure heroin. By early 1970, Southeast Asian-produced heroin was ready to be tested on GI guinea pigs. Meyer Lansky, facing charges of business illegalities, turned over control to Trafficante and fled to Israel. On July 4th, Lansky Narcotics Associates reportedly made their investment plans for Southeast Asia at a 12-day meeting with representatives of several mafia families at the Hotel Sole in Palermo, Sicily. Weeks later, the Corsican mafia contemplated counter-moves in a meeting at Philippe Francini's suite in Saigon's Continental Palace Hotel. Turkish opium production was already waning and could no longer be relied upon. Unrest in the Middle East was destabilizing the production of morphine base. The Corsicans had to do something to regain control over their long-time Southeast Asian domain, a task made all but impossible by the U.S. presence. But the Corsicans still had large stocks of morphine, their Marseille labs, and a smoothly functioning smuggling network. Trafficante and company could agree that if the Corsicans were to be neutralized, it had to be done totally and effectively. That was a job for President Nixon and his White House staff, the BNDD White House Death Squad, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, we looked in our last broadcast at what Henry Kruger calls the Great Heroin Coup, and we're going to take a look at that here in just a second.
Okay, before we do that, since this seems like a nice place to break, and all of you out there with the 90-minute tapes or whatever can turn them over here, we're going to take a short break for a few minutes, listen to a little music, give you a chance to let some of that preparatory material soak in. As when we come back, as Dave said, we're going to talk about the coup itself, and the changeover, and the direct profiting thereby of the American intelligence establishment, and begin to thread together some of the connections that will make so much sense when you start reading the news again tomorrow morning, if you're not familiar with this stuff already. So we'll be back in just a couple of minutes after taking a break. Don't go away, and we will return in a few minutes with more of, I'm having trouble talking tonight, with more of Radio Free America right here on KFJC. Thus we are returned. This is Nip Tuck with Dave Emory in the studios and Radio Free America continuing. And we've just been hearing the opening segment of the broadcast. Again, a large part of most of the first part of the broadcast, actually a large part of the broadcast entirely, is from Heinrich Kruger's The Great Heroin Coup, a wonderful book, South End Press, 1980 in paperback. If you can find a copy, get it and read it and carry it around with you and make other people read it. It's really a fine book.
And if you can't find a copy, we will have, by the time this broadcast is finished, put more than a third of the book on tape. So even if you can't dig up a copy, peruse these tapes at considerable length and detail, and you'll have an awful lot of the good material under your belt.
Now, we talked at the beginning of the broadcast, and in the course of putting this together, about two main things. Well, first of all, the specific subject matter from the Great Heroin Coup having to do with the Lansky mobs basically taking in hand the Cuban mafia, and with the help of Santo Trafficante, Lansky's lieutenant and now his own man, with Lansky's passing from the scene, the Lansky mob basically took over a large part of the heroin trade. And at the same time, because of their involvement with the Cuban mafia and their involvement with the anti-Castro Cubans, came into direct contact with the CIA and the Bay of Pigs operation. And as we talked about, there's a thread of traffic going all the way from World War II and intelligence operations in World War II, starting actually during the war and continuing through the end of the war and getting the Nazis out of Europe and into Central and South America, and contacts made there through going on through there, up through the 1954 coup in Guatemala, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Dominican Republic incursion, the assassination of John F. Kennedy in '63, Robert Kennedy in 1968, Martin Luther King, Watergate, and right on up to today with the whole Iran scandal that has quote-unquote rocked the White House. But believe me, folks, that ain't nothing as to what is underneath, and which, if we're really lucky, some of this may break surface in the next few months, but we will see what we will see. But anyway, so there's a very direct line with what we're talking about tonight, dating clear back into the 40s. Some of the same players are still involved, like Theodore Shackley, today in the self-same Iran/Contra scam.
Now, what we're going to be doing right now is reviewing a chapter which we read in its entirety, actually reprising, I should say. We're not going to review it. We're going to reprise a chapter which we had in the last Radio Free America broadcast, number 26. This details Henry Kruger's analysis of the Great Heroin Coup. Now, in a nutshell, the Nixon White House, closely allied, as we've just seen and as we looked at in our last broadcast, with the Lansky Trafficante heroin smuggling syndicate, and with the CIA, of course, which in turn intersects very heavily with the same aforementioned syndicate. Basically, they collaborated, and a fellow named Lucien Conein, part of the Shackley team and the operations group in Southeast Asia, put together a group of, quote, ex-CIA men, unquote, who then proceeded to dispatch many of the key people in the Corsican syndicate, and thereby handing the Trafficante mob a corner on the heroin trade for all practical purposes in this country. In addition, as we're going to see, and this is in many ways going to represent the point of departure for the broadcast this evening, many of these same elements also appear to have been heavily involved in the bevy of right-wing terrorist incidents centering largely around anti-Castro Cubans, which plagued Latin America and other parts of the world in the 1970s and also on up into the 1980s. And the title for tonight's broadcast could be, as we said, in fact will be, the subtitle of Henry Kruger's book, Drugs, Intelligence, and International Fascism. The Great Heroin Coup, as Henry Kruger put it, the use of the BNDD White House intelligence squad to corner the market for the Trafficante mob, is going to represent the, as I said, the point of departure for our study of the triad of intelligence, specifically the U.S. national security establishment, the narcotics traffic, and right-wing terror in Latin America and other places.
All right, continuing with Henry Kruger writing about the central thesis of his book, The Coup itself. This chapter, Kruger writes, contains my personal interpretation of the Great Heroin Coup. Errors are possible on any or all points, inasmuch as the clandestine operations treated in this book transpire in a closed world infested with lies and cover-ups. There will always be loose ends. The coup itself, which transferred control over the heroin gold mine from one part of the world to another, I regard as a fact of life. Similarly, do I regard the involvement of elements of the White House staff. Just how high up it went, the reader can decide for him or herself. Of the many heretofore mentioned details in the coup's planning and execution, I find the following essential. 1. Prior to the coup, the Lansky syndicate narcotics boss Santo Trafficante Jr. had made the necessary arrangements in Southeast Asia and Mexico and had started a war with the Corsican mafia. 2. Trafficante's old partner, the CIA, had long since assumed control over Southeast Asia opium smuggling following Ed Lansdale and Lucien Conein's defeat of the local branch of the Corsican underworld. 3. In 1971, when the coup's execution was seriously underway, Cuban exiles, a group with which Trafficante enjoyed a unique rapport, appeared in the White House's mysterious narcotics operation. They were tied especially to Conein and E. Howard Hunt. 4. Through a succession of bureaucratic reorganizations, the White House assumed control over narcotics intelligence and enforcement. 5. U.S. narcotics officials waged an all-out war against the Corsicans' Turkey, Marseille, USA network, while warning of a serious heroin threat. Excuse me, let me read that one again. Number 5. U.S. narcotics officials waged an all-out war against the Corsicans' Turkey, Marseille, USA network, while warnings of a serious heroin threat from Southeast Asia were all but dismissed. 6. When the Corsican Mafia was neutralized, the narcotics enforcement apparatus was suddenly reorganized as the DEA, and shortly thereafter, heroin began flowing into the United States from Southeast Asia and Mexico. 7. The CIA infiltrated DEA, grabbed control of Latin America's political repression apparatus, was accused of protecting major narcotics dealers, and was exposed as an accomplice to gun running financed with the profits from the narcotics traffic. 8. The White House protected Robert Vesco, who appears to be a central figure in the scheme of heroin smuggling and gun running.
We should add, too, we talked about Robert Vesco in Radio Free America number 25. We will be dealing with many of the Vesco connections to the Iran-Contra scandal and the drug smuggling and terror aspects of that same scandal in a 3-part series, probably 4 hours each, that we're going to be doing in May during the KFJC Month of Mayhem. Continuing with The Great Heroin Coup by Henrik Kruger. In these 8 points, we find the will, the power, and the motives, not for the once-proclaimed victory over the traffickers, but for the dramatic transfer of underworld power that suddenly became a reality in 1973. The syndicate was in on it, the White House, the CIA, and special lobby groups were in on it too, at least indirectly. But we still need to ask who in particular and why. We will rely on logic and guesswork only to identify individual accomplices and their particular contributions and motives. Let us first consider the Lansky syndicate represented by Santo Trafficante and his Cuban narcotics mafia. In addition to motives he might have shared with the CIA, Trafficante had many other reasons to take part in the heroin coup. First, it meant cheaper heroin deliveries and therefore greater profits. Second, he wanted the Corsicans out because, behind his and the rest of the syndicate's backs, they had begun setting up their own U.S. distribution network. Finally, Trafficante's drug mob did not want to see a repeat of BNDD Operation Eagle, U.S. Drug Enforcement's last effective raid against his network. What were the possibilities for Trafficante's playing an active role in the coup's execution, apart from preparation of the Southeast Asia and Mexico-based networks? Without help from the CIA and powerful lobbies, his chances were slim. With their assistance, he could infiltrate the narcotics nerve center, the White House. Here, we might discuss just who, in fact, helped him. If it is true that Trafficante fought the Corsicans so bitterly from 1971 on, how can it be that Marcel Boucan, B-O-U-C-A-N, and his shrimp boat were seized in February 1972 with 425 kilos of pure heroin en route to Trafficante in Florida? There is only one explanation, which Boucan himself offered in court, that Boucan was set up by his American client. How else can the unprecedented seizure by French customs following a tip from the CIA be explained? If it was a plot to exhaust the stocks of the remaining French heroin rings and thereby cause panic among the Corsicans, then it worked. How guilty was Richard Nixon, who presided over the heroin coup? Personally, I believe that under strong pressure, he was a more or less willing tool rather than the force behind it all. Pointing to Nixon's guilt are his close association with the Cuba lobby, with people connected to Lansky and Trafficante, and with Robert Vesco. In addition, his dirty tricks department relied heavily on Cuban exiles. The Cubans would never have supported him with dangerous criminal acts, demonstrations, donations, and votes if he had really been out to eliminate their most profitable business. Nixon would have been ruining the Cuban mafia, and to an extent the syndicate as well, and thereby his friends in Florida. He would have been digging his own grave. Thus, Nixon tackled the drug problem as he did every political problem. He followed the path of least resistance. And that meant ignoring his criminal allies in Florida and Southeast Asia while he hounded the Corsicans, who had no constituency, to death.
Continuing. That Nixon might have been involved in the heroin coup for his own personal gain is lent credence by the following quote from Dan Molday's respective book, The Hoffa Wars, published Charter Books, 1978. Quote, a former Nixon aide, not privy to the Hague investigation, says that one of his associates in the White House mentioned to him sometime, quote, during the impeachment summer, unquote, that someone high up, maybe White House Chief of Staff Hague, was interested in Nixon's, quote, possible organized crime involvements. That conversation involved, quote, a massive payoff from those in, quote, Army Service Club scandals in Vietnam, unquote, during 1969 or 70. The aide says that the Service Club ripoffs, quote, involved the mafia and millions of dollars, and that the main focus of the interest by, quote, someone high up in the White House was on whether the top mafia guy, unquote, who ran, quote, all these things in Southeast Asia had made payoffs to Nixon. The crime figure, he says, was, quote, the one who was apparently known as the so-called mastermind or architect of the Southeast Asian drug trade, who was very powerful and very well known as a mob leader. According to government narcotics experts, the central figure in the Indochina Golden Triangle narcotics traffic was Santos Traficante, unquote. In my opinion, the central manipulator in the whole narcotics scheme was the CIA, or rather a faction within it. It is erroneous to treat the agency as a monolith. Various lobby groups have their own agents in the company, generating internal power struggles that reflect political polarizations external to the CIA. There are, doubtless, CIA factions wholeheartedly in favor of ending America's policeman and oppressor roles and in favor of social democratic rather than right-wing regimes. Equally certain is the fact that one should take the agency's new, outwardly benign face with a grain of salt. Within the agency, there remain powerful groups promoting continued support of, quote, old friends in Latin America and Southeast Asia. The China-Cuba lobby has traditionally been one of the most influential within the CIA, and there is little reason to believe that the situation has seriously changed. Finally, the agency has laid low of late, as the Carter administration has lobbied for a relaxation of constraints placed upon it by Congress in the wake of the 70s exposés of CIA horror stories. In addition to, or rather behind, the CIA's new official policy, there is also an unofficial one. It manifests itself in such matters as the manipulation of the DEA to perform what previously had been CIA dirty work, and in the toleration, if not encouragement, of a large, apparently independent army of Cuban exile terrorists, available for action in Latin America at the request of the presiding dictators. The evidence suggests that the forces behind the unofficial policy were able to place many of their loyal CIA agents in the DEA, and in such private intelligence agency covers as Intertel and Wackenhut, where they continue their tasks while letting the agency wash its hands. Intelligence is still gathered by the CIA, but some of the dirtiest operations are now performed by, quote, former agents. Let's just exaggerate that last point again because it's a very important one for what we've been talking about, and it's going on right this very moment. The evidence suggests, Kruger writes, that the forces behind the unofficial policy were able to place many of their loyal CIA agents in the DEA and in such private intelligence agency covers as Intertel and Wackenhut, where they continue their tasks while letting the agency wash its hands. Intelligence is still gathered by the CIA, but some of the dirtiest operations are now performed by, quote, former agents, unquote. And let's bear that very strongly in mind in light of the current Iran-Contra scandal with people like Ed Wilson currently in jail in Texas for doing basically what other people have also been doing, all of them working legally for the agency, but with the agency maintaining the shield of deniability.
So again, what we're looking at here are former, unquote, CIA agents working for the DEA, not only here, to eliminate the Corsican competition with the Nixon and Lansky-allied Santo Traficante mob, also CIA-allied, but more importantly, or not, I shouldn't say more importantly, but also, as we're going to be looking at in the broadcast, using those same organizations, basically the national security establishment was using those same organizations to implement right-wing terror throughout the world, Latin America in particular. Continuing with Henry Kruger's account. We cannot, of course, discount the possibility that the unofficial policy is in fact executed by former agents who had either been purged from the agency or left in protest against its more moderate line. However, that implies that a renegade CIA faction now runs an independent secret service aided by lobby interests, i.e. not Intertel, but an even more powerful third force. If that is so, I can come up with only one lobby group with the relevant motives as well as the power to back them, the World Anti-Communist League, or WACL. WACL can mobilize CIA agents closely associated with the China, Cuba, Chile lobby, especially the large contingent of former agents of the Galen-Vlasov organization, the intelligence agency run by Hitler's master spy Reinhard Gehlen, which became the BND, the West German equivalent of the CIA. E. Howard Hunt was clearly the China-Cuba Latin America lobby's man. That he is also tied to WACL is suggested by the fact that William F. Buckley, Hunt's close friend for 20 years and the godfather of his children, was one of WACL's top U.S. supporters. Also connected to the same lobby groups are Lucien Conein and the State Department's former intelligence chief, Ray S. Klein, who continues to be a frequent guest at the Taiwan WACL stronghold. Hunt and Conein were the vital forces behind the White House's great heroin coup. Hunt secured the Cuban exiles their necessary footing, and he got his friends Bernard Barker and Manuel Artime to set up hit teams to kidnap and murder Latin American narcotics traffickers. According to Frank Sturgis, those traffickers included members of Auguste Ricord and Christian David's Grupo Francais. Hunt persuaded Egil Crow to bring CIA agents into the White House narcotics apparatus. He told Crow that he knew, quote, key CIA officers who could be temporarily detached from the agency and employed by the new liaison group. It was Hunt who recommended Lucien Conein to head the group. Finally, it was intelligence reports from the CIA and Conein's group which made White House narcotics actions focus almost exclusively on the Corsicans. Conein's close friend, Mitch Rebel III, told journalist Jim Hogan he, quote, found it difficult to believe that a lifelong spy of Conein's stature could ever really leave the CIA. Accustomed to the use of other government agencies as CIA covers, Rebel quite naturally held open the possibility that Conein's DEA job was no more than an exercise in sheep-dipping the backgrounds and identities of the Dirty Dozen, all of whom were CIA veterans, unquote. But a desire to help its old friends in Southeast Asia and Latin America was not the CIA's only motive for promoting the heroin coup. The Gaullists in France, including their loyal adherents in intelligence agency SDECE and their dirty tricksters in SAC, were, in the de Gaulle era, the CIA's arch-enemies as well as rivals for control of the world heroin trade. One can well imagine the CIA joining forces with Georges Pompidou and other pro-U.S. forces in France in crushing the old Gaullist intelligence network. In 1973, with the Corsicans finally pushed out of the picture, the White House reorganized the narcotics effort to form the DEA. Almost immediately, heroin began flowing to the U.S. from new sources of supply. Journalist Ron Rosenbaum cites the following statement by a U.S. Customs official, quote, BNDD and Customs are finally getting somewhere. They break up the French connection. They're getting big conspiracy cases. Suddenly, they, the White House, step in and there's this big shake-up, and by the time people get back to work, the Mexican connection is set up, protected, and doing big business. What's that say to you? Unquote. He might have added that the Southeast Asian connection was also protected and doing big business. The emergence of the DEA was the next to last phase of the heroin coup. Hunt and Conein's CIA agents moved into the DEA intelligence operations, Conein locating 12 Latino CIA agents in his Special Operations Group. The Dirty Dozen was officially created to combat Cuban and Latin American narcotic smugglers, allegedly following the assassination approach conceived in the darkest corners of the White House.
It must have been a gag. Conein's forces were apparently directed for the most part against small-time independents who had competed with the big-time traffickers in on the heroin coup. The biggest Cuban network, Centro Traficantes, went untouched. Miami's 1974-75 murder wave in Little Havana might even have been connected to the activities of Conein's Cubans. The victims had opposed Orlando Bosch's drive for solidarity in terrorism, a drive which, as suggested by writer Hogan, that's Jim Hogan, author of Spooks, etc., a drive which, as suggested by writer Hogan, might well have enjoyed the support of Traficante and Robert Vesco. Of the latter two, certainly the first and quite possibly the second as well were central figures in the heroin coup. That brings us to the last, the political phase of the heroin coup, which began with the DEA's 1974 takeover of the CIA's Latin American torture and repression apparatus and ended with the 1976 creation of CORU, C-O-R-U, Bosch's terrorist mercenary army. Quote, ended is, however, the incorrect word, since the brutalities financed by the heroin coup continue. The DEA, or that part of it penetrated by the CIA, protects the major narcotics dealers. The latter, in turn, support, financially and through gun running, anti-communist paramilitary groups which work hand-in-hand with Latin American police and military forces whose death squads and torturers are supervised by agents of the DEA. I'm going to read that last part again because this describes exactly what is turning up about the Contra connection. The DEA, or that part of it penetrated by the CIA, protects the major narcotics dealers. The latter, in turn, support, financially and through gun running, anti-communist paramilitary groups, which work hand-in-hand with Latin American police and military forces whose death squads and torturers are supervised by agents of the DEA. The infiltration of the DEA and the variety of political assignments for its agents have caused such violent splits within the Bureau that one can speak of two wings which fight one another. One wing carries out guns for drugs and protection programs. The other tries desperately to combat the drug traffic carried out or protected by the first. Among the expressions of this bitter internal strife, apparently, are the Cecilia Falcon and Werbel cases, and the dismissal of DEA Director Bartels for suspected corruption. Recently, the use of drug profits to finance right-wing terrorism has been placed in a new perspective by revelations of Cuban exile teamwork with European and Latin American fascists, and the economic support of WACL for the same anti-communist groups. And that brings us to the final link in the chain of drugs, intelligence, and fascism. And by the way, as we mentioned, this book was written in 1980 about events largely happening between 1970 and 1979. But indeed, as we keep pointing out, as we point out many times tonight, these are the exact same events that are going on now. It's almost the same team. It's certainly Shackley, Kleins, Frank Turple et al. Are all the same people.
Members of the Bosch organization, anti-Castro Cubans, veterans of Brigade 2506. And it's worth noting, too, that in the next section of that great heroin coup that we're going to be talking about, a chapter, I should say, that Kruger calls the Miami Conspiracy, many of the anti-Castro Cubans and CIA-related groups that are performing many of the acts we're going to be talking about, that at the time they were doing it, George Bush was director of the CIA. He now, of course, is vice president, but his name has been cropping up in a big way, although it has been submerged from the public spotlight to a considerable extent, not to mix a metaphor. But George Bush is one of the main names to think about here. We're going to be talking about George Bush in, again, the 3-4-hour programs that we're going to be doing in May on the Iran-Contra scandal. We'll be reprising certain features of the material we're putting up here, and we'll be focusing on George Bush and many of the narcotic smuggling connections to this whole scam in May.
Okay. As Dave mentioned, this is we're going to go on now, and we're going to continue with Kruger's final link in the conspiracy, and specifically we're going to talk about, among other things, the Miami office, and again mentioning George Bush. Don't forget George Bush's long sojourn down there with the drug task force, which Frank Turple, a man who, as we've said before, whose veracity is questionable but whose insider information is not, Frank Turple suggested that what George Bush was doing was helping to continue the CIA's past habit of using the DEA to inject CIA agents directly into the Latin American drug and gun politics.
Okay, now, again, we're going to be dealing with a chapter of the Great Heroin Coup, the concluding chapter before the postscript, this called the Miami Conspiracy. Early in 1980, Alan Pringle, head of the DEA's Miami office, told an Associated Press reporter that Miami banks constitute, quote, the Wall Street, unquote, of the drug dealers. To the reader of this book, that should come as no surprise. Nor should Patrice Cheroff's claim to me that Miami was the main station of the fascist front organization World Service. Yet the significance of Miami in the netherworld of international fascism remains one of America's better-kept secrets. In June of 1976, Hervé de Vatere, V-A-T-H-A-I-R-E, the financial director for Mirage jet manufacturer Marcel Dassault, spent a week in Miami together with soldier of fortune Jean Kay of Spain's neo-fascist Paladin group. While there, they had several meetings with Cuban exiles. Upon their return to France, the two disappeared with over $1.5 million in Aircraft Corporation funds. It was then reported that the money went to support Christian phalangists fighting in Lebanon, but some French observers believe it financed two great French bank robberies. On the weekend of July 17th and 18th, 1976, 20 men set out on an expedition through the sewers of Nice to the Société Générale Bank. There, they stole upwards of $10 million. When the robbery's mastermind, Albert Spaggiari, S-P-A-G-G-I-A-R-I, was arrested that October, he fingered La Catena, a cover name for a coalition of Spanish and Italian fascists, the Paladin Group in particular. Most of the take went to finance their operations. A second sewer heist was executed in August of 1976, this time at the Société Générale Paris branch on Ile Saint-Louis. The amount was $5 million. Immediately after the Nice heist, Spaggiari traveled to the U.S. and contacted the CIA. According to a confidential source, he had also been in Miami shortly before the heist. The French Le Point and L'Aurore reported that the agency was compelled to pass on its information about Spaggiari to French authorities. In early 1977, Spanish police arrested Jorge Cesarski of Argentina's fascist terror organization, the AAA, and Carlos Perez, a Miami-based Cuban exile, in connection with a string of murders of young Spanish leftists. According to the Spanish daily El País, Perez and a large number of other Cuban exiles were in Spain as part of a newly created fascist international.
Continuing. In 1976, OAS and Adjutant Press terrorist Jean-Denis Rangard, spelled R-A-I-N-G-E-A-R-D, was in the United States seeking the support of such right-wing leaders as Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina for an OAS coup in the Azores in the wake of Portugal's left-wing military revolution. The coup, if successful, would bring a rightist government and U.S. control over the militarily strategic Atlantic archipelago. According to an FBI investigation of Rangard, on 19th of November 1969, the Bureau had sent Portuguese police a questionnaire on his connection to an OAS front, the Adjutant Press. The questions concerned a prior Rangard trip to Miami during which he had a run-in with the law. When asked about Rangard's troubles, the State Department's Portugal desk officer in 1975, William Kelly, said, quote, "I would prefer not to address the question of the French connection," unquote. What are European fascists doing in Miami before and after major operations? Why are Miami-based Cuban exiles executing contracts on young Spaniards? Why was the main station of the CIA-supported fascist front World Service in Miami? Why did bank robber Spaggiari contact the CIA in the United States? Miami is the center of a huge conspiratorial milieu whose personnel wind through the Bay of Pigs, attempts on Castro's life, the JFK murder, and the Great Heroin Coup, and which is now reaching out with a vengeance to Latin America and Europe. To trace the roots of this milieu, we must refer to the immediate aftermath of World War II, when the CIA began its close cooperation with Adolf Hitler's espionage chief Reinhard Gehlen and the Soviet general Andrei Vlasov of Russia's secret anti-communist spy network. Vlasov's organization was absorbed into Gehlen's, which evolved into a European subsidiary of the CIA. U.S. and German agents mingled in Berlin and West Germany, paving the way for inroads into U.S. intelligence by forming former Nazis, SS agents, and Russian czarists.
Bear in mind now the connections of not only Frank Sturgis, but in particular Theodore Shackley, head of station JM Wave, to the U.S. intelligence operations in Europe and the Gehlen organization in particular. Shackley, of course, a key player now in the Iran-Contra scandal.
Headquarters of the CIA Gehlen-Vlasov Combine, staffed in the mid-50s by 4,000 full-time agents, were in Pullack, near Munich. There Gehlen sang to the tune of more than one piper, having remained in touch with the old Nazi hierarchy relocated in Latin America, whose coordinator, Otto Skorzeny, was in Spain. Skorzeny had infiltrated the Spanish intelligence agency DGS and effectively controlled it single-handedly. With the onset of the Cold War, Gehlen's agents were recruited by the CIA for assignments in the United States, Latin America, and Africa. One agent, reportedly, was Frank Bender, allegedly alias Fritz Schwend, a key figure in the Bay of Pigs invasion. U.S. historian Carl Oglesby sees the origin of much of the CIA's later sinister record in the alliances it forged almost immediately upon its birth with the Gehlen-Vlasov organization and, through Operation Underworld, with the Lansky crime syndicate. Quote, "Everything after this," meaning the Gehlen alliance, "on top of Operation Underworld was probably just a consequence of this merger. How can a naive, trusting, democratic republic give its secrets to crime and its innermost ear to the spirit of Central European fascism and expect not to see its constitution polluted its traditions abused, and its consciousness of the surrounding world manipulated ultimately out of all realistic shape.
Continuing. Well put. Moreover, it is ironical that Europe's contribution to U.S. fascism is now returning home and threatening the continent in a conspiracy supported by U.S. economic and clandestine forces. The forces Oglesby speaks of were united during and after the Bay of Pigs affair, and their bedfellows were big businessmen with their own private interests. The merger was toasted in Miami. The Bay of Pigs invasion itself was not the most important phase in the development. That was CIA Station JM Wave and its Operation 40, the agency's secret war on Cuba from the summer of 1961 until the end of 1965, 4 years during which a truly conspiratorial powerhouse was forged in Miami. Station JM Wave was unique in the annals of the CIA, as attested to by then Deputy Director of Intelligence Ray S. Klein. Quote, "It was a real anomaly. It was run as if it were in a foreign country, yet most of our agents were in the state of Florida. People just overlooked the fact that it was a domestic operation," unquote. With the start of its secret war, the new station became the agency's largest and the command post for its anti-Castro operations worldwide. Its annual budget of $50 to $100 million financed the activities of 300 permanent employees, most of them case officers who controlled an additional several thousand Cuban exile operatives. Each major CIA station had at least one case officer assigned to Cuban operations who ultimately reported to Miami. In Europe, all Cuban matters were routed through the Frankfurt station, which in turn reported to JM Wave. JM Wave covered anything and everything Cuban, wherever in the world it might be. Cuban representatives were shadowed in Japan, and a Cuban exile-led commando unit was sent to Helsinki to sabotage the 1962 International Socialist Youth Conference. As JM Wave was closing down in 1967, the agency sent another team of saboteurs to France to contaminate a shipment of lubricant bound for Cuba with a bacterial substance developed under its mind control project MK-Ultra. When poured in oil, it would ruin motors and other machines. I mention these scattered incidents only to elucidate the situation around the October 1965 murder of the exiled Moroccan opposition leader Mehdi Ben Barka in Paris. Ben Barka must have been JM Wave's number 2 target after Fidel Castro between the fall of 1963 and the end of 1965. I would interrupt and say I think perhaps John Kennedy would have been the number 1 target, exceeding both Ben Barka and Castro. I think the evidence pointing in that direction is rather compelling. Continuing with Kruger's account. Castro in 1963 had asked Ben Barka to arrange the first tricontinental Castro in 1963 had asked Ben Barka to arrange the first tricontinental Congress, which was to be held in Cuba in January of 1966. The conference, aimed at Third World solidarity against U.S. imperialism and support for Castro in Cuba, would signal a major setback for JM Wave and the CIA's plans for Latin America, where all the agency's major operations in the 1962-6 JM Wave era were focused.
In 1963, the agency masterminded a revolution in Honduras, another in the Dominican Republic, and a third in Guatemala. In 1964, it assisted in General Branco's military coup in Brazil. In 1965, the Special Forces joined U.S. Marines in suppressing civil war in the Dominican Republic, and in 1966, the CIA aided and abetted Colonel Ongañez's military coup in Argentina. Cuba was an especially hot number in 1965. Led by JM Wave personnel, the CIA had planned a new invasion of the island to follow one of its attempts to assassinate Castro. The planners included Howard Hunt and James McCord. Unlike the Bay of Pigs invasion, this time the agency was offering leadership in addition to training and financing. However, one byproduct of the 1965 intervention in the Dominican Republic was the aborting of the plan to invade Cuba. The CIA, Station JM Wave in particular, must have been anxious to know Ben Barka's plans for the Tricontinental Congress and to sabotage them if possible. And time was running out after Ben Barka's September 1965 visit with Castro. Thus, the key to solving the Ben Barka murder case appears to lie with 3 men: JM Wave Chief Theodore Shackley, Morocco Station Chief Robert Wells, and the head of the CIA station in Frankfurt. CIA contract agent Fernand Legros is also known to have associated with Ben Barka in Geneva. The same Legros, Legros, who frequented Miami, the Bahamas, and other spots in the Caribbean. When J.M. Wade was dismantled, Shackley and his staff left Miami for Laos, leaving behind a highly trained army of 6,000 fanatically anti-communist Cubans allied to organized crime and powerful elements of the U.S. far right. In 1966, following the Tricontinental Congress, which proceeded without Ben Barka, a counterfront, the World Anti-Communist League, WACL, was chartered in Seoul, South Korea by hardline reactionaries from the world over. That same year, Adjunter Press, sponsored by WACL and the intelligence agencies of the United States, France, and Portugal, was created in Lisbon as a cover for OAS terrorists and other European fascists. Led by the Frenchman Yves Guérin-Serac, its aim was the subversion through espionage, sabotage, and murder of all that the Tricontinental Congress had stood for. In that same period, Cuban exile activist organizations sprouted all over Miami's Little Havana. They spawned, in turn, terrorist subgroups like Alpha 66 and Omega 7, whose more notorious leaders, Guillermo and Ignacio Novo, Orlando Bosch, and Nazario Sergen, had all been trained by the CIA. Between 1965 and 1971, they staged sporadic acts of sabotage and assassinations, with Guillermo Novo repeatedly arrested only to be released each time. Cubans, terrorists among them, were also being paid by Santo Traficante and the syndicate to help spin their intricate U.S. narcotics web. And they also found the time for dirty tricks on behalf of Richard Nixon and his White House staff. However, incidents like Operation Eagle of 1970, when the BNDD, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, rounded up Cuban exile drug traffickers and found many to have been trained by the CIA, had made the Cubans an increasing embarrassment to the agency. As the 70s began, the CIA's Cubans had become an angry, confused, and divided lot who felt betrayed by their former employer. Still, they experienced a comeback midway through 1971 when the powers that be, CREEP in the fore, of course that's the Committee to Re-elect the President, again sought their services. And in 1973, with the military in power in Chile, they found a new employer in the ruthless Chilean secret police, DINA, D-I-N-A. Other dictators south of the border have followed suit.
Continuing. In 1974 and 5, a reign of terror struck Miami's Cuban community as opponents of Orlando Bosch were liquidated. The campaign continued well into 1976, during which Miami was rocked by over 700 bombings. And that year there was a notable upsurge in Cuban exile activity beyond the territorial U.S. On April 6th, 2 Cuban fishing boats were attacked and destroyed, and 1 fisherman was killed. On April 22nd, a bomb exploded at Cuba's Lisbon embassy, killing 2 and seriously wounding several others. In June of 1976, in the Dominican Republic town of Bonao, the Cuban Action Movement, the Cuban National Liberation Front, Brigade 2506, F-14, and the Cuban Nationalist Movement merged as Bosch's Coordination of United Revolutionary Organizations, or CORU, C-O-R-U. On July 5th, a bomb exploded at the office of Cuba's UN delegation. On July 9th, another went off at Kingston Airport in Jamaica in baggage about to be loaded onto a Havana-bound Cuban flight. The next day, there was an explosion at the Bridgetown, Barbados office of British West Indian Airways, which also represented Cubana de Aviación. On July 17th, bombs went off in the Cuban airline office and embassy in Bogota, Colombia. On July 23rd, a Cuban technician was killed in Merida, Mexico, trying to stop the abduction of the Cuban attaché. On August 9th, terrorists kidnapped 2 diplomats assigned to the Cuban embassy in Buenos Aires. On August 18th, a bomb exploded at the Cubana de Aviación office in Panama. On September 21st, Chile's former Secretary of State, Orlando Letelier, and his co-worker, Ronnie Carpin Moffett, were killed in Washington when a bomb decimated their car. On October 6th, yet another explosion gutted a Cuban airliner off Barbados, killing 73. On November 7th, one exploded at the Cubana de Aviación office in Madrid. Finally, on November 9th, kidnappers seized an Argentine employee of the Buenos Aires Cuban embassy. Orlando Bosch's army of anti-Castro Cuban terrorists was responsible for all these acts. When the Cuban airliner went down, Bosch himself was arrested in Venezuela. But the extremists had not waited until 1976 to take part in international terrorist operations. In 1975, 100 anti-Castro Cubans joined European fascists in the Army for the Liberation of Portugal, ELP. From neighboring Spain, the ELP, whose core comprised Agentar Press OAS veterans, attempted to overthrow Portugal's progressive military regime. By the way, once again, the OAS here is not the Organization of American States, but the secret army organization, the group of French fascists who attempted to murder French President Charles de Gaulle in revenge for his having given up Algeria as a French colony. Continuing with the account. The 1975 attempt in Rome on the life of Chilean Christian Democratic Party leader Bernardo Leighton was a joint action of DINA, the youth wing of the Italian Fascist Party, MSI, and anti-Castro Cubans. The 1976 murder of Letelier and Moffat, a DINA Carew job, was planned in Miami. 4 of the 5 Cubans involved in it were CIA veterans of the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Leighton attempt and Letelier murder were each coordinated by the American-Chilean DINA agent, Michael Townley.
Continuing. The common denominator in Carew, as well as Internacional Fascista, a combine of anti-communist extremist organizations chartered at an October 1976 meeting in Rome attended by Carew representatives, appears to have been the CIA, or at least a faction thereof. Carew's headquarters are in Miami. Originally, it was sustained by tight collaboration with the CIA and the Chilean junta's secret police. According to the Cuban former CIA agent Manuel Darmas, the CIA coordinated DINA's acts with Carew's. DINA, of course, the Chilean secret intelligence agency, Carew, the Cuban exile group. According to Manuel Darmas, the CIA coordinated DINA's acts with Carew's and supplied the latter with funds, advisors, and explosives. The head of DINA's Miami-based force was reportedly Eduardo Sepulveda, the Chilean attaché in Miami and a top dog in DINA. Internacional Fascista is the outgrowth of many years of planning in Madrid by the late Nazi Otto Skorzeny, who in the 50s had worked for the CIA. On its roll are former SS agents, OAS terrorists, hatchet men for Portugal's dreaded Secret Service, PIDE, terrorists from Spain's Fuerza Nueva, Argentine and Italian fascists, Cuban exiles, French gangsters from SAC, and former CIA agents hardened by terror campaigns in Operation 40, Guatemala, Brazil, and Argentina. Besides Carew, Internacional Fascista's militants have at various times numbered the Army for the Liberation of Portugal, the ELP, and its Agentar Press contingent under Yves Guérin-Serac. The Italian Ordine Nuovo, led by Salvatore Francia and Pierluigi Concutelli, Spain's Guerrillas of Christ the King, Asociación Anticomunista Ibérica, and Alianza Anticomunista Apostolica, AAA, which is not to be confused with the Argentine AAA that is also represented in Internacional Fascista, and the Paladin Group. SS Colonel Skorzeny was the kingpin of the Paladin mercenary group until his death in 1975. Dr. Gerhard Hartmut von Schubert, formerly of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, was its operating manager. Headquartered in Albufera, Spain, its actual nerve centers were Skorzeny's export-import offices and cover firm, MC, located at a Madrid address shared with a front for the Spanish intelligence agency, SCOE, under Colonel Eduardo Blanco, and also an office of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. The cozy relationship of Spanish right-wing terrorists with U.S. and Spanish intelligence is further underlined by the SCOE's purchase in the mid-1970s of Werbel's silenced M10 machine pistols. That's Mitch Werbel they're talking about, the Georgia weapons manufacturer and paramilitary trainer. The cozy relationship of Spanish right-wing terrorists with U.S. and Spanish intelligence is further underlined by the SCOE's purchase in the mid-70s of Werbel's silenced M10 machine pistols, prior to which the terrorist weapon had been unavailable in Europe. Shortly thereafter, the M10 turned up in the hands of Spanish and Italian terrorists. A melange of former OAS and SAC figures and West German rightist activities and mercenaries, Paladin joined terrorist actions in Europe, Africa, Latin America, and even Southeast Asia. Along with Italian fascists, Paladin is responsible for the December 17, 1973 bombing of Rome's Fiumicino airport, which claimed 32 lives. On behalf of the Spanish government, Paladin kidnapped and murdered leaders of the Basque ETA, and in 1974-76 engineered some 50 bombings in Basque country.
before I continue here with Kruger's account, many of these incidents, and we're not going to go into them here, were related in considerable detail in other Radio Free America shows, notably Radio Free America 19, dealing with the P2 Lodge and its intersection with many of the same elements we've talked about here. Continuing with Kruger's account. Paladin's bankrollers included Skorzany's weapons empire and Libyan head of state Muammar Gaddafi. The Skorzany-controlled World Armco, with its main offices in Paris, was registered in the name of Paladin manager von Schubert. Upon the death of Skorzany in 1975, von Schubert moved to Argentina, but returned 6 months later to reorganize. In the spring of 1976, he raised eyebrows with a want ad in the International Herald Tribune for a pilot, navigator, captain, 3 demolitions experts, 2 camouflage experts, 2 specialists in Vietnamese, and 2 in Chinese. Applicants were directed to a Paladin office in Spain. Internacional Fascista was a crucial first step toward fulfilling the dream not only of Skorzany, but also of his close friend in Madrid exile, José López Rega, Juan Perón's Grey Eminence, and Prince Giusto Valerio Borghese, the Italian fascist moneyman who had been rescued from execution at the hands of the World War II Italian resistance by future CIA counterintelligence whiz James J. Angleton. They and other Nazi and fascist powers throughout Europe and Latin America envisioned a new world order built on a fascist iron circle linking Buenos Aires, Santiago, Lima, La Paz, Brasilia, and Montevideo. In 1973, their goal seemed near. Chile's President Allende had been overthrown. Perón had regained the Argentine presidency after 17 years of exile. Hugo Banzer was still in control in Bolivia, as was Alfredo Stroessner in Paraguay, and other right-wing military regimes ruled Brazil and Uruguay. When he returned to Argentina, Perón brought with him López Rega as an advisor. The latter would wield great influence over both the aging president and his wife Isabel, and import hatchet men from Spain to help the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, the AAA, slaughter the Argentine left. In 1976, however, fascist plans suffered a setback. Isabel Perón, who had succeeded her late husband, was ousted from office and López Rega was chased out of Argentina. Argentina's contingent of international terrorists then followed López Rega back to Spain and were joined there by several of their Argentine colleagues, among them Commissioner Morales and Colonel Navarra. Portugal's revolution and the liberation of Mozambique and Angola that followed further complicated the fascist game plan. However, Third World terrorist actions continued. In 1976, a 7-man fascist commando group dispatched from Spain was arrested in Algeria following an act of sabotage. Its leader identified himself as Aurelio Bertin. In truth, he was J. S. Sablonsky, a native Philadelphian also known as J. Salby. Another member of the unit disclosed that he had contacted it in Madrid through one Gilles Maxwell, an American working for a real estate agency run by the former U.S. Air Force Colonel August Woltz, W-O-L-T-Z.
Continuing, Salby was a ringleader of Aginter Press, and later the ELP. Together with Guérin-Serac and other Euro-fascists, he had worked for the CIA in Guatemala from 1968 to 71 in the unprecedented terror campaign which followed the August 1968 assassination of U.S. Ambassador Gordon Main. The campaign, allegedly set in motion by Main's successor Nathaniel Davis, was modeled after Vietnam's Phoenix program. It afforded an early glimpse at the teamwork of European fascists with Miami-based CIA-trained Cuban exiles. According to Amnesty International, some 30,000 people were either killed or disappeared in Guatemala in the decade beginning in 1962, the worst of it coming in 1970 to 71. A later released FBI document revealed that Salby and former OAS terrorist Ranger, mentioned at the start of this chapter, had been in Miami in 1969 on leave from participating in mass murder in Guatemala. Correspondence in 1971 from Aginter Press leader Serac to Sablonsky is addressed to J. Salby, Seaboard Holding Corporation, 1451 Northeast Bayshore, Miami. Ranger again shuttled between Miami and Guatemala in late 73. As to Ambassador Davis, he moved on to bigger things in Chile. A terrorist contingent which would train commandos for the Chilean fascist party, Patria y Libertad, whose co-leader was reportedly Davis's next-door neighbor, followed soon on his heels from Guatemala. After a coup d'etat replaced Salvador Allende with Augusto Pinochet's military junta, some terrorists moved on to Argentina, while others, Salvi among them, rejoined Agenter Press in Portugal. As fascist terror then struck Europe, Davis became the U.S. ambassador in Bern, Switzerland. By coincidence, Dina's chief of foreign operations, Pedro Ewing, set up an office in the same city. The southern European left, most vocally the Italians, then protested repeatedly against the presence of Davis, who was regarded as a coordinator of the terror. Eventually, he was relegated to the happy hunting ground of the Foreign Service, the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. In 1976-77, International Fascista made its presence felt often in Europe. West Germany's fascist and neo-Nazi groups doubled. After Spain and Italy, though, it was in France that the fascists were most industrious, with the old standbys from SAC assuming a new role. When 7,000 SAC agents were fired in 72-73, many joined fascist groups in Spain, Paladin in particular. Paladin's OAS contingent let bygones be bygones.
Continuing. What has made sleuth work difficult is International Fascista's attempts to camouflage itself as an arm of the left. When General Joaquin Centeno Anaya, Bolivia's ambassador to France, was shot down in Paris in May of 1976, a caller to the police claimed that the Che Guevara Brigade had murdered him to avenge the 1967 capture of Guevara in Bolivia. An eyewitness, moreover, claimed to have recognized the assailant as the infamous left-wing terrorist Carlos. However, 1 month later, the Nouvel Observateur reported that the assassination had been planned at Madrid's Consulada Hotel by Bolivian intelligence agent Saavedra and 3 terrorists from the Paladin group. Furthermore, inspection of Centeno Anaya's politics revealed his opposition to Bolivian President Banzer and allegiance to ex-President Torres, whose murder in Argentina followed shortly after Centeno's. Then it was the turn of former Chilean Foreign Minister Orlando Letelier to be murdered by Chilean and Cuban terrorists in Washington, soon after which the establishment U.S. press, citing CIA and FBI sources, pointed the finger at the Chilean left. I would interrupt here that the CIA director at the time was George Bush. In connection with these assassinations, it's appropriate here to quote in its entirety a recent report entitled Latin America, Murder Incorporated, unquote. Again quoting, a still classified staff report on questionable foreign intelligence operations in the United States, prepared for the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on International Operations, sheds some new light on cooperation in security matters between Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay. According to the Senate report, which has been leaked to the press in the United States, the joint operation is known as Condor. The Senate report mentioned a Phase 3 of Operation Condor, which involved the formation of special teams to carry out sanctions, unquote, including the assassination of the enemies of its constituent governments. The best-known killing of this type was the bomb attack on Orlando Letelier in September of 1976 in Washington. Condor's role in this emerged during the testimony of the FBI agent Bob Shearer, who investigated the case and gave evidence at the trial of Michael Townley. He testified to the use of Condor as the channel by which the Chilean DINA chief, General Manuel Contreras, tried to get U.S. visas for 2 of the agents involved. An impressive list of murders may now be laid at the door of Operation Condor. These include the killings of General Carlos Prats of Chile and Juan José Torres of Bolivia in Argentina, the Uruguayan politicians Héctor Guiterres Ruiz and Zelmar Michelini, also in Argentina, Bolivia's General Joaquin Centeno Anaya and Uruguay's Colonel Ramon Trabal in Paris, and the attempted assassination of the Chilean Senator Bernardo Leighton. The Senate report disclosed that Condor had considered establishing its own operational base in Miami in 1974, but that this was headed off by a CIA protest, quote, through regular intelligence channels, unquote. In this case, the CIA informed the Chilean DINA of United States displeasure, and no Miami station was opened. According to the Senate report, the FBI concluded early in its investigation of the Letelier assassination that the murder might have been carried out as a 3rd phase of Operation Condor. Presumably, 3rd phase will now go into the lexicon of euphemisms alongside the CIA's to terminate with extreme prejudice. The fact that the operation was well known to the United States at least 5 years ago makes nonsense of its shocked surprise at the time of Orlando Letelier's death." End quote. That was all a direct quote of the report.
Continuing. The advent of democracy in Spain was fought bitterly by Internacional Fascista. At least 70 lives fell victim to the struggle within the first half of 1977. On January 24th, fascists armed with machine pistols stormed a midtown Madrid attorney's office and opened fire on 12 lawyers who had defended leftists. 6 of the lawyers were killed. The rest were seriously wounded. Over the next 3 days, right-wing terrorists murdered 4 others, 2 of them students, which led to the arrest of Carlos Perez, the Cuban exile associated with the Argentine AAA. On February 22, 1977, Madrid police discovered a factory where Italian Ordine Nuovo fascists had manufactured handguns. The building had been rented from an order of nuns by Otto Skorzeni's friend Mariano Sanchez Covisa. Following up their discovery, the police investigated a bank box in the name of Italian fascist kingpin Elio Massagrandi. In it, they found a small fortune and 3 gold bars traceable to the $10 million bank robbery masterminded by OAS alumnus Albert Spaggiari. This led to the roundup of most of Spain's Italian fascist elite: Stefano Della Chiai, Marco Pozzan, Elidore Pomar, Clemente Graziani, Salvatore Francia, Flavio Camp, Mario Rosa, Enzo Salzioli, plus Massagrandi and his wife Sandra Cricci. Spanish authorities, however, were pressured by the Italians' local protectors, and the terrorists were soon released. Many of them headed to Argentina and eventually returned to Europe. Massagrande and one Gaetano Orlando went to Paraguay, where they were arrested in December 1977 and released within days on orders from dictator Stroessner. There they remained. In August 1977, the Spanish AAA stole jewels worth $20 million from the cathedral at Oviedo. The police recovered most of the jewels when several terrorists were stopped at the Portuguese border. That same month, Internacional Fascista's Italian, Spanish, Argentine, and Cuban exile terrorist contingents were represented at a Taiwan assembly of the World Anti-Communist League.
Continuing. In April of 1978, the parties behind Internacional Fascista formed an umbrella organization, Eurodroit, or Euro-Right, as a response to Euro-communism. Charter members included Giorgio Almirante's Italian Fascist Party, MSI, Spain's Fuerza Nueva, led by Blas Pinar, France's Force Nouvelle, PFN, led by Jean-Louis Tixier-Vigancourt, Belgium's Front National, and Greece's Rassemblement Général. In May, Almirante and others represented Eurodroit at the Wackle Assembly in Washington. On June 27, 1978, Eurodroit met in Paris, and on July 18th, its leaders met in Madrid with Latin American observers including Ricardo Curuchet of Argentina. Its representative at the April 1979 Wackle Assembly in Paraguay was Fuerza Nueva's Pinar. Finally, in 1979, several Eurodroit members were elected to the first European Parliament. The springboard of this chapter was what I deem the Miami conspiracy. Inevitably, I am drawn to suspect that international fascist operations are, to some degree, directed from Miami. World Service, the cover organization Patrice Charoff told me was based in Miami, was of the same ilk as Agenter Press, whose agents Rangiar and Salbi were in and out of Miami. Miami Cubans joined Agenter Press terrorists in Guatemala. The Nice bank robber Albert Spaggiari was allegedly in Miami before his heist and was definitely in touch with the CIA in the U.S. after it. 10 months later, money and gold stolen from the bank were in the safe deposit box of an Italian terrorist leader in Spain. Mirage director Duvater and Paladin agent K flew to Miami before their theft of Mirage millions and met there with Cuban exiles. 100 Florida-based Cubans joined the Agenter Press ELP army in Spain, where they became involved in acts of terrorism. Michael Townley and other DINA agents were in Miami to plan the murder of Orlando Letelier, and Townley also engineered an attempt on Bernardo Leighton's life in Rome. The old JM Wave operation is born again, only it is no longer confined to Cuba and the Third World, but now encompasses a bitter struggle against a new enemy, Euro-communism. The hometown of CIA fronts like the Sea Supply Corporation, Double Check Corporation, Zenith Technical Enterprises, Gibraltar Steamship Corporation, and Vanguard Service Corporation and the site of ominous Fontainebleau Hotel meetings between Santo Trafficante, Sam Giancana, John Roselli, Robert Mayhew, William Harvey, and Meyer Lansky, remains the birthplace of conspiracy. And to close the circle, let us not forget that gangsters and former espionage agents among International Fascista and Carou's minions were knee-deep in the heroin trade, that still floating in the quagmire are extraordinary international agents E. Howard Hunt and Fernand Legros, and that several Spaggiari gang bank robbers had been the close associates of both François Chappé and Christian Beausers David, whom this book was at one time to have been all about. We're going to take a break here, and then we're going to come back. We're going to discuss a little bit about the very dense and important chapter we've just been through, and we're going to pick up then, following that discussion, with a discussion of Christian Beausers David, and we're going to talk about some of the Auguste Ricord mob and an extension of the Ricord mobs associated. Well, the Ricord mob was associated with Klaus Barbie, and we're going to talk about an apparent extension of that. And we're going to talk about Klaus Barbie, the cocaine coup in Bolivia of 1980, and a lot of other equally charming events.
Indeed. So don't go away. We're going to take a break and play some music, give you a chance to wiggle your toes and kick your feet a little bit, and then we're going to be back for more, and as Dave said, we've got another 2 hours of information, all kinds of stuff. So Dave Emory and myself, Nip Tuck, will return in just a few minutes with more of One Step Beyond, right here, One Step Beyond, with more of Radio Free America, right here on KFJC. And we return with more of Radio Free America. This is Nip Tuck with Dave Emory in the studios at KFJC. We're going to be here until approximately 11 o'clock tonight, give or take a few minutes one way or the other, because as Dave so aptly put it, we never quite know how these things are going to come off, but time-wise anyway. So, however, we spent a long session. Actually, we should probably review some of that last chapter, because that's a lot of exceedingly complicated stuff having to do with the International Fascista and a veritable crossword puzzle of interlocking acronyms there. The SAC, the OAS, Carew, DINA, ELP, the whole bunch of them. But essentially, the strongest connection that needs to be made tonight, one is not expected to know whether, when one says AAA, one is talking about the Spanish AAA or the Argentine AAA. But the point is the very strong connection made early on between the, quote, legitimate intelligence services, organized crime, the drug traffic, and right-wing paramilitary, fascist politics and fascist terrorist action. And that's, in fact, as Dave mentioned, drugs, intelligence, and international fascism is, in fact, the title and the category of tonight's broadcast.
Perhaps the most significant aspect of that particular chapter was, obviously the information is highly significant, but in his conclusion to that chapter, Henrik Kruger stated that the old JM Wave station is born again. That, with perhaps a very unintentional, though, in the year 1987, the book was written in 1980, an excellent pun on the ultra-right-wing evangelical movement which is going around, that the old JM Wave station, headed by Theodore Shackley, is indeed born again. Something to contemplate here in calendar year 1987 is the extent to which the Contra supply operation is not only very similar to station JM Wave, in which was basically a CIA covert operation run from the United States with, again, the same sort of coalescing of ultra-right-wing elements, various Nazi and Klan groups, civilian material assistance, and others basically being taken under the umbrella of the U.S. national security establishment. But the incorporation of the nexus of mafiosi, of organized crime, various intelligence agencies around the world, primarily the U.S. intelligence agencies, and specific fascist elements, combining to place the operations for right-wing terror around the world, Latin America in particular, under the the CIA infiltrated DEA. The interrelationship here between the narcotics traffic and the terrorist elements cited in that chapter is the key thing we're focusing on here. We're going to be coming back to that same nexus in our three-part series, which we have scheduled for May, and we'll be giving you the dates later, which is going to deal with the Iran-Contra scandal, involving many of the same elements and the same people we looked at here. The International Fascista, and specifically that passage we've read in a number of other Radio Free America broadcasts, the intersection, for example, of Muammar Gaddafi with the Paladin group, the right-wing Italian elements, well, right-wing, that's a euphemism, the fascist Italian elements such as Stefano Della Chiai, Prince Justo Valerio Borghese, and some of the others we looked at, Jose Lopez Rega of the Argentinian P2. We looked at them in great detail in our series about the Pope shooting, Radio Free America's 17 through 21. Theodore Shackley, a key player in that situation, is also obviously one of the individuals who looms large in this whole complex. The book that we're reading from, The Great Heroin Coup, again, it was copyrighted in 1980, came out right at the end of that year. Obviously, I think in calendar year 1987, it's turned out to be rather unnervingly prophetic. The very same Miami conspiracy that we're looking at, basically Kruger postulates that Miami is the nerve center of international fascism, closely allied with the U.S. national security establishment, looms even larger in the wake of the revelations of the Iran-Contra scandal, and we're going to be looking at those, as I said, in great detail in May in another series. Now, one of the elements in Heroin Kruger's analysis here that we're going to be looking at concerns Christian or Chrétien Beauserge David. He was a Corsican gangster employed first by the SAC, the anti-OAS group of Corsican gangsters employed by the French government to resist the attempted fascist coup in France. Later, as Kruger has indicated, particularly after the 1968 riots and street demonstrations in Paris, the SAC was welcomed back by the ultra-right-wing elements in Paris, and in France, I should say, and the SAC became part of the International Fascista. We're going to go back to the Great Heroin Coup now, and we're going to take a look at the functioning of Christian Beauserge David. His nickname was Beauserge. We're going to look at his role not only working with the Ricord mob. Auguste Ricord was a Corsican gangster, a Nazi collaborator who fled to Latin America to avoid prosecution by the French authorities after the war. He then teamed up with, among others, Klaus Barbie, the SS and Gestapo chief of Lyons. Klaus Barbie, of course, as we've looked at in the past and has been widely documented in the popular press as well as any number of books, Klaus Barbie worked as an agent of the Galen organization, and we're going to be taking a look at the collaboration of Klaus Barbie, Auguste Ricord, and Christian David, not only in the heroin trade, but also in operating hand in glove with right-wing death squads in particularly Uruguay and Brazil. And in particular, we're going to take a look at looming, I should say, in the background of that is, of course, the CIA and the other U.S. intelligence services. Following our analysis of Henrik Kruger's, our expose, I should say, our reading of Henrik Kruger's analysis of the Auguste Ricord, Barbie, Christian David collaboration and their role with death squads, we're going to move on to an analysis of Klaus Barbie, his cocaine operation in Bolivia, and the so-called cocaine coup of 1980 involving the Fiancés of Death that we looked at in Radio Free America number 19, the group of cocaine mercenaries, basically, who operated hand in glove not only with the Bolivian national security establishment, but with elements of our own. And the cocaine trade is going to loom large in the final couple of hours of our broadcast this evening. Obviously, we will be looking at cocaine smuggling and its intersection with the U.S. national security establishment in our analysis of the Iran-Contra scandal.
Okay, reading from The Great Heroin Coup. Auguste Ricord and his gang of heroin merchants were riding high when they were joined by Christian David in the latter half of the 60s. Each year, they transported hundreds of kilos to the huge U.S. market, and without the noticeable losses that narcotics traffickers must normally contend with. Its street value, depending on competition, lay somewhere between $1 and $2 billion annually. At the end of World War II, Ricord fled from France in a death sentence for collaboration with the Gestapo. He wandered for several years in search of an underworld niche. By the end of the second year, 3 of his companions in exile had been murdered. In 1947, Ricord arrived in Buenos Aires with the name Lucien d'Argel. Some say he had with him the millions he'd pocketed during the war. Others say he had to start all over. What's certain is that he opened an exclusive restaurant in Argentina at the close of the 50s and soon had a chain of restaurants and motels throughout Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia, each with the name Paris-Nice and an Eiffel Tower prominently out front. The motels evolved into a high-class brothel chain, and Ricord quietly began trafficking in narcotics. At the start of the 60s, Ricord moved his headquarters from Buenos Aires to Asunción, Paraguay. There he could feel at home among the old Nazi luminaries who had found safe haven under President Alfredo Stroessner. Ricord also regained contact with an old acquaintance then residing in neighboring Bolivia, former Gestapo chief Klaus Barbie, the killer or butcher of Lyons. Ricord had much in common with Barbie, alias Klaus Altmann, inasmuch as the former had assisted the Gestapo at torture and the rounding up of French Jews. Since the disclosure of Barbie's whereabouts, French and German authorities alike have vainly sought his extradition for the murder of hundreds. In 1966, old man Ricord enlarged his already immense narcotics network upon discovering how easily he could smuggle heroin into the U.S. via Latin America. For some reason, the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, the BNDD, largely overlooked the danger from the South until the 70s. It eventually grew wiser, estimating that 50 to 60% of the Marseille-produced heroin on the U.S. market entered via Latin America, which generally meant by way of Ricord and company. The old man surrounded himself with hardcore thugs. By 1970, the mob's leaders were Ricord, sentenced to death in absentia for treason, torture, and murder; Lucien Sarti, wanted for the murder of a Belgian policeman; Christian David, sentenced to death in absentia; André Condamine, wanted for the murder of a policeman; Jean Lunardi, wanted for murder; François Chiappe, wanted for 2 murders; and a French gangster and former SAC agent, Michel Nicoli. They also had a network of henchmen encompassing nearly every metropolis in Latin America. The money poured in, some of it to be reinvested in restaurants and nightclubs in Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, and Caracas. But Ricord lost his grip on the reins. Before long, David Condamine and Sarti took over, reducing the old man to a figurehead who drank foaming Münchnerbrau with Die Alte Kameraden in one of Asunción's many German bars.
Continuing. Marseille heroin was transported to Paraguay from embarkation points in Barcelona, Lisbon, and Brussels. In charge of transportation were Condamine as well as Chiappe, who often traveled between his Buenos Aires base and Barcelona, where his suppliers were the Orsini brothers of the Corsican Mafia. The heroin was transported by air and by sea. Part of it went via Brazil, then either overland to Paraguay or directly to the USA. Some of it sailed up the Paraná River to Asunción. The greater part of the heroin sent north arrived aboard small planes known as Mau-Maus, which generally refueled in Panama before flying on to either Florida or Mexico. There they were unloaded and shipment was continued overland. Paraguay had long been one of the great smuggling centers of the world. With 200 private landing strips scattered among the haciendas, it was impossible to monitor the enormous number of private flights. And no one seriously bothered to try, since numerous government officials pocketed shares of the take. According to Jack Anderson, Ricord's accomplices included some of Paraguay's highest-ranking officers, Pastor Coronel, the intelligence chief, General Andres Rodriguez, leader of an elite 3,000-man force especially trained by the Americans, and General Vicente Quinones, the Air Force chief of staff, who was responsible for Asunción Airport and other landing fields. Soldiers from an elite corps, according to Anderson, were stationed to guard the contraband stores for Ricord and other big-time smugglers. Worse still, in the wake of Anderson's sensational revelations came rumors that Paraguayan Air Force officers had even flown Ricord's heroin to the United States in military aircraft. Unlike Ricord, David didn't simply rake in the money. He thrived on danger. According to U.S. narcs, in at least 3 instances, Beauserge himself transported large quantities of heroin into the United States using the pseudonym Jean-Pierre, by which he was known exclusively among friends in the Ricord mob. David also maintained the organization's good relations with police and spooks in Latin America. He took on assignments for Argentina's terrorist organization, the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, or AAA, and probably did the same for Brazil's notorious death squad. Grupo Francais, as Ricord's network was known in Latin America, had found a prize in Chrétien David because of his connections to SAC and French intelligence. Through him there grew new branches in the narcotics network, including one centered about the Félix Lesca gang and the Lyons SAC chief Jean Auger, and another about Joe Attia's gang, SAC leader Ange Simon Pierre, and the Swiss banker André Hirsch.
Okay, moving back a little bit to study a little bit more about Beauserge himself. The murder of Police Lieutenant Galibert caused a major sensation in France. Despite what seemed to be an all-out manhunt, the wily Christian David, aided by friends, eluded Galibert's colleagues in the anti-gangster squad. In the fetish club of Neuville-sur-Rhin, outside Lyon, Beauserge bided his time. A big-time bordello and a haunt of the Guérini clan, the club was a frequent rendezvous of David's friends in SAC. Reportedly, Meme Guérini at first favored delivering his body to the police, but powerful forces must have intervened as mafia bosses were persuaded to help Beauserge flee from France. One day, in March 1966, a car picked him up at the fetish club and drove him to a Guérini outpost on the outskirts of Marseille. Skipping down. His reputation having preceded him in Latin America, David was welcomed into the Ricord organization with open arms and soon moved into its highest ranks. Also part of Beauserge's reception committee were agents of the SDECE and SAC. His arrival coincided with a powerful French diplomatic offensive in Latin America. With the U.S. wading into a quagmire and into China, and otherwise preoccupied with the Soviet Union, de Gaulle, and more so Jacques Foccart, sought to entrench themselves as deeply in Latin America as they had in Africa. De Gaulle planned to come on like the Great White Father, the Third World's only friend, but Foccart, F-O-C-C-A-R-T, felt that wouldn't suffice. He moved several of his most trusted men from Africa to Latin America. Between 1965 and 1968, for example, we find the notorious Colonel Roger Barbereau as France's ambassador to Uruguay, and Dominique Ponchardier its man in Bolivia. If anyone stands for cloaks and daggers, it's these two, whose names turn up in a string of France's most sensitive espionage scandals. Foccart's men moved where they saw the greatest openings, supporting right-wing forces in a region already in the grip of military dictatorship. Barbereau and Ponchardier offered to help these regimes break the back of left-wing insurgency. For that they needed men without scruples, men like Christian David. On arrival in Argentina, David met François Chiappe, wanted in France for a pair of murders. Chiappe, also known as Big Lips, had worked for the Guérini mob and was on excellent terms with politicians and right-wing militants in Argentina. He was also a top member of the Ricord organization. The Ricord network was divided into 4 teams that operated independently out of separate headquarters. Ricord himself ran the main team from Asunción, Paraguay, and oversaw the entire operation. Chiappe and Michel Nicoli led another team, Dominique Orsini and Louis Bonsignor a third, and André Condamine and Lucien Sarti a fourth. Other important names in the organization were Claude-André Pasteur, Didier Baron, and Michel Bouboul-Sang. And I'm not going to bother to spell all the French names because we're not even going to go over many of these too many times. It was Murder Incorporated in French. Nearly all had been sentenced to death in France.
Continuing. Baroni, besides belonging to the Felix Lesca gang, had teamed up on art swindles with the aforementioned CIA agent Fernand Legros and with Legros's forger Émile de Horry. Pasteur was similarly interesting. In December of 1968, Enrico Pasili, a weapon-smuggling friend of Chrétien David's, was murdered in Rome. Almost simultaneously, Thierry de Bonnet, another close associate of Legros, died in a mysterious auto accident. Italian police suspected Pasteur in both killings, which were committed while he was on a trip back to Europe. The Ricord network operated freely south of the border because its members helped repressive regimes fight the left and smuggle arms, sometimes combining the two profitably. While he was helping intelligence groups infiltrate guerrilla movements, Chrétien David found new customers for his weapons. The major arms deals, though, were with fascist militant groups in Argentina and Chile. Through connections, Schiapp secured David an Argentine passport in the name of Carlos Eduardo d'Evreux Bergeret. Beauserge then went on secret missions for French intelligence. His first assignment to infiltrate Douglas Bravo's Venezuelan urban revolutionaries led nowhere. In early 1967, Bravo was expelled from the Venezuelan Communist Party and police smashed his organization. Once relocated in the hills, Bravo was wary of spies. Following the false start in Venezuela, Beauserge flew to Mexico and met with 2 African agents. They handed him a contract to eliminate African politicians. It's not clear whom he was to murder and whether or not he succeeded, but he was in Africa several months, and murder was a task he rarely muddled. Upon returning to Latin America, he joined Ricord in Asunción before planting himself in Argentina. In late 1967, David, alias Eduardo d'Evreux Bergeret, managed to infiltrate the Fuerzas Argentinas de Liberación, the FAL, one of the most active guerrilla groups in stormy Argentina from 1967 to 71. Among other actions, it kidnapped Auguste Ricord's close friend and Paraguay's consul in Argentina, Valdemar Sanchez.
Relying on his experience with the instruments of death, David soon became the FAL's arms instructor and ingratiated himself with its members. In the end, he made off with its files and a cash box containing $250,000. While fleeing, he allegedly slew an FAL leader and a lookout. He headed with his prize to Central America. Eventually, the SDECE made a deal for the papers with the Argentine government, which led to the arrest of several guerrillas and the death by torture of one. Soon thereafter, David went to Uruguay, where the French ambassador was Roger Barbereau, the same Barbereau who 4 years later would be associated with the French Connection heroin affair that also involved Beauserge. In May 1968, Barbereau and Dominique Ponchardier were unexpectedly rushed home to Paris to help quell French student unrest, forcing Focard to put his plans for Latin America on hold. After 1968, Beauserge was more or less a freelance agent. While remaining in close touch with the Focard network, he also took on assignments for security police and political death squads in Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, and thereby inevitably for the CIA. In Montevideo, he reconnected with his mistress, Teresa, who just happened to be a member of the Tupamaros. Through her, Beauserge infiltrated Latin America's best organized band of guerrillas. Uruguay's president, Pacheco Areco, had already begun a determined struggle against the revolutionaries. Assisting his police and armed forces was a squad of CIA agents expert at torture and anti-guerrilla warfare. 2 of these agents, Dan A. Mitrione, M-I-T-R-I-O-N-E, and Claude L. Fry, spelled like it sounds, were captured by the revolutionaries. Mitrione was given the death penalty by a people's court, while Fry suffered a heart attack and was released. Beauserge appears at first glance to have done more for President Areco than the entire conventional CIA team, but on this job he probably collaborated with U.S. intelligence. Also assisting him was Jacques Focard's full-time man in Uruguay in Roger Barbereau's absence, Jean-Baptiste Listroni, who became David's go-between with the Uruguayan government. David must have been quite an actor, since he even fooled the legendary Tupamaros leader Raúl Sendic. After robbing a bank, the guerrillas handed Beauserge $400,000 for the purchase of weapons. He then flew off, as if to complete the deal, to Focard's personal fiefdom and beehive of the weapons trade, the African nation of Gabon. While he was away, however, the guerrillas somehow learned not of his escapades in Argentina, but of his role in the Ben Barca affair. They decided to set a trap for him, but once back in Uruguay, Beauserge smelled trouble and rushed to the security police, who soon arrested 150 guerrillas in the strongest blow they dealt the revolutionaries. It was a handsome feather in the cap of President Pacheco Areco. For his troubles, David was reportedly given $200,000 in addition to the $400,000 of which he had relieved the partisans, plus an Uruguayan diplomatic passport in the name of Edouard Davrieux. The passport made David the heir apparent of Auguste Ricord. With it, he traveled freely to the U.S. and Europe, controlling and expanding the international narcotics network. There's also a somewhat unbelievable story about David's departure from Uruguay. In the transit hall of Montevideo Airport, a stewardess reportedly brought him a package. Suspecting a bomb, Beauserge had the stewardess open it herself. She screamed when she did. Inside was the head of Teresa, a goodbye gift from the Tupamaros.
Now, the point to make here, of course, is that as we look at the conclusion of this book, the strong intersection between fascist politics and the narcotics traffic, and in turn, David's work with the U.S. intelligence apparatus in Uruguay, is worth noting here. Now, what we're going to begin looking at next, and we're going to take a look at a section from Parapolitics issue number 6, put out by Jonathan Marshall, we'll get to that in a second, is what appears to have been, at least to a certain extent, an extension of the Ricord mob taken over by Chrétien David. And remember now that Ricord worked closely with Klaus Barbie, only this time the main product that they're moving is cocaine and not heroin. And we're going to take a very close look at the so-called cocaine coup in Brazil in 1980 in just a second. Now again, bear in mind that Chrétien David, a French gangster who at one time, or apparently for quite a while, worked in an official capacity for the French government, worked hand in glove with various reactionary regimes in Latin America, and also apparently with the U.S. intelligence apparatus. We're returning now to a publication that we've used a number of times in the past. This is Parapolitics. Parapolitics is a newsletter distributed by Jonathan Marshall to investigative reporters and political researchers. Marshall is currently the editorial page editor of the Oakland Tribune, formerly functioning in the same capacity for the San Jose Mercury News. In an essay in Parapolitics number 6, from the issue closing March 31st, 1982, Jonathan Marshall has authored an essay called The Business of Terrorism. And we're going to talk a little bit about the David Ricord mob and the collaboration with Klaus Barbie and the apparent extension of at least elements of that particular mob into the cocaine trade. And in turn, we're going to take a look at the cocaine trade's close involvement with U.S. intelligence in the 1980 cocaine coup. Reading now from The Business of Terrorism by Jonathan Marshall in Parapolitics number 6. The French connection, of which Lebanon was such an important part, was shifted to Latin America in the 1960s under the guiding eye of French and Italian fascists and criminals, including, as mentioned above, Tommaso Buscetta. Through Latin America, drugs could be moved with the help of corrupt governments and military administrations into the United States, evading tight customs controls or ports in the northeastern United States, evading tight customs controls on ports in the northeastern United States. The ring was ostensibly headed by Auguste Ricord, a former Nazi collaborator who relocated after World War II to Paraguay, where he was assisted by Nazi escapee Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyons, who made his home in Bolivia. One of Ricord's closest assistants was Chrétien David, a former leader of the Gaullist strong-arm squad Service d'Action Civique that battled the OAS in Algeria and France in the early 1960s. SAC recruited heavily from the underworld, and David was one of those gangsters whose activities was sanctioned by the French state as long as he didn't overstep the bounds. But he was forced to flee to Latin America when, having been implicated in the political murder of Moroccan leftist Mehdi Ben Barka and in the shooting of a French police lieutenant, his political allies could no longer protect him. In Latin America, however, he kept in touch with his friends in the FOCAR network, and on behalf of local military intelligence agencies, infiltrated the Uruguayan Tupamaros guerrillas and fingered their leadership. Touring around the continent on an Argentine passport, he tried the same tactic in Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela. But David's real livelihood was crime, in particular trafficking in heroin. He was joined at the apex of the Ricord network by a former OAS henchman, Francois Chiappe, who, like David, now put politics aside. David and Chiappe were arrested in 1972 after the United States brought enormous pressure to bear on Latin regimes that harbored the traffickers. Interrupting, of course, we took a look at the hypocrisy in that pressure. That was the great heroin coup analyzed by Henrik Kruger. And, of course, the relationship between the people involved in that, the Nixon White House, the U.S. intelligence apparatus, and the resulting right-wing terror triad, which Kruger calls the Miami conspiracy, we've just covered throughout the bulk of the broadcast. Continuing with Marshall's account, David was eventually extradited from Brazil to the United States, where he remains in prison. Chiappe, however, was mysteriously freed from prison by Argentine authorities just in time for him to take part in a military intelligence-sponsored massacre of left-wing Peronists at Azizia Airport in June of 1973. Chiappe became an enforcer for the right-wing Peronist Minister of Social Welfare, José López Rega, a P2 member, who ironically used U.S. military aid to entrench himself as Argentina's preeminent narcotics trafficker. One of López Rega's closest allies and the organizer of the Azizia massacre, Colonel Jorge Osinde, went on to become Argentina's ambassador to Paraguay, a nerve center of the French connection. The French connection, with its terrorist ties, lives on in Bolivia, home of the Bridegrooms of Death, a cocaine syndicate headed by former Gestapo boss Klaus Altmann, a.k.a. Barbie. Altmann, wanted for war crimes in France, is a close associate of Bolivian Colonel Luis Arce Gomez, who became Interior Minister following the notorious cocaine coup that the two men helped organize in 1980. Arce controls a fleet of private planes that he uses to move cocaine. He also commands a force of several hundred agents in the Special Security Service who divide their time between running drugs and torturing political prisoners. According to the New York Times, quote, reportedly aiding the colonel is a team of more than 20 foreign mercenaries from France, Italy, Belgium, Argentina, and other countries. Some of them say they are neo-Nazis. Last year, they helped establish and train the Special Security Service, which became the vanguard in storming government ministries and labor unions in last year's coup, in which more than 40 people died. That, from the New York Times of August 3rd, 1981, that's why it talks about last year. One Special Security Service trainer is former SS Commandant Albert von Ingelom, who served 20 years on a Nuremberg conviction. Other German Nazis from Altmann's contingent, 8 of them altogether, were arrested by Brazilian police for bringing 6 pounds of cocaine across the border. Also in their possession were a pair of machine guns and a pile of Nazi propaganda. So the extension of at least elements of the Ricord mob, notably Klaus Barbie, a.k.a. Klaus Altmann, is worth noting here. We're going to take a look at the cocaine coup touched upon here by Jonathan Marshall in this essay. We're going to take a look at that coup, the role of Stefano Della Chiai in the Bridegrooms of Death, connections between that coup and the World Anti-Communist League, mentioned by Henrik Kruger, and the last thing we're going to take a look at is the role of U.S. intelligence in that coup.
Okay, we're going to read now from a book called The Nazi Legacy. The subtitle is Klaus Barbie and the International Fascist Connection. It's copyright 1984 by Holt Reinhardt and Winston. It's written by 3 authors: Magnus Linklater, Linklater, Isabel Hilton, and Neil Asherson, Asherson, The Nazi Legacy. I'm going to read a little bit more about Klaus Barbie and how the Bolivian Coca Fascista connection was set up. Dividing his time between Santa Cruz, his elegant house in Cochabamba, and his apartment in the Edificio Jazmín on Calle 20 Octubre in La Paz, Barbie shared his views about the coup with a small group of neo-fascists whom he met regularly. To them, he would explain that their plan should be seen in a far broader context than just Bolivia. It was, after all, part of the battle against communism, he said, a battle which should have been fought 40 years earlier in Europe, but was now more important than ever. For the fiancés of death in Santa Cruz, the preparations for the coup, according to a former member of the gang, came with a visit from Barbie. Quote, one day Klaus Altmann came to see us. That, of course, was Barbie's pseudonym when he was first in Latin America. One day Klaus Altmann came to see us. Quote, the moment has come, he said. We have to overthrow this government before Bolivia becomes another Cuba. With the other foreign comrades, we are getting together a security service. You have to cooperate. But first, you must be tested. We began to follow the union demonstrations, to keep files on the opposition, to threaten and punish subversives. We worked well. We even had a private prison for the torture, which we left, however, to the Bolivians. Their political advisor was Barbie's lawyer, Adolfo Ustares, who used to address the gang with the words, quote, we must kill all the communists, to which the group's commander would reply, quote, count on us, we are ready for everything. In La Paz, Barbie kept in touch with developments through a new friend, Emilio Carbone, Carbone, an Italian neo-fascist in his 30s who had left Italy rather suddenly in 1970. After a period in Spain, Carbone had arrived in Bolivia, where he started publication of a fascist magazine, which he also sent back to his old contacts in Europe. His connections with senior military officers in Bolivia were impressively close. Through the young Italian, Barbie began to learn more about the neo-fascist groups in Europe, their links with South America, and their somewhat tortuous ideology. The two would meet regularly in the Café La Paz, together with other contacts. Both men had realized that if the planned coup was to succeed, they would need expert help. Arce Gomez had expressed the view that they needed someone ruthless. Quote, "Bolivians are not hard enough," he said. In late 1979, Carbone was able to announce that help was on its way. Quote, "Two Italian friends," he said, "are in Central America. They will be here in a few days." Within a week, they had both arrived in La Paz. A young man calling himself Mario Bononi, and a somewhat older man, very small in stature, with a pointed goatee beard, who said he was Alfredo Modugno. Bononi, it emerged, was a 25-year-old neo-fascist whose real name was Pierluigi Pagliai, and Modugno was Stefano Della Chiai.
Continuing with the Nazi legacy. There was little doubt that the two Italians were a valuable addition to the team. Both knew Latin America well, and they knew the right people. Della Chiai's contacts dated back to Spain and his work with Lopez Rega of Argentina's AAA death squads. From 1976, he had helped DINA, the Chilean secret police, to locate and neutralize, unquote, Chilean exiles, and here, too, had gone into the news agency, unquote, business with a DINA-financed outfit called AIP, along similar lines to Guérin Sarac's Agenter Presse. By mid-1977, he was so well established inside the Chilean security apparatus that he claims to have persuaded many DINA officers to wear the Ordine Nuovo insignia, the double-headed axe and its SS-inspired motto, "Our honor is our loyalty." In 1978, however, Della Chiai had to move somewhat rapidly to Argentina. A scandal had broken in Chile following the murder in Washington of Orlando Letelier, former ambassador of President Allende to Chile. It emerged that the murder was the work of American-born DINA agent Michael Townley, a close friend of Della Chiai, carried out on the orders of Manuel Contreras, head of DINA and Della Chiai's protector. As Contreras' position weakened, Della Chiai slipped quietly out of the country. He took with him the 25-year-old Italian neo-fascist Pierluigi Pagliai, who, like him, had fled from Italy after a right-wing terrorist attack. Argentina was a natural choice as their next base. The military dictatorship which had seized power in 1976 offered Della Chiai in particular similar opportunities to those he had enjoyed in Chile, and he already had friends in Buenos Aires. But even so, it was not easy to gain a foothold. When they first arrived in February of 1978, said one right-wing activist from that time, they didn't know many people. They asked me to help them make contacts in military intelligence, unquote. A few introductions followed, but progress was slow. This was frustrating, for Della Chiai had ambitious plans. He dreamed of making Buenos Aires a neo-fascist center with its military regime a model to be applied throughout Latin America. At the beginning of 1979, he began to travel visiting other right-wing regimes on a journey which took him first to Paraguay, then to the troubled region of Central America, already a potential gold mine for those offering, quote, security services, unquote. It is here that the threads of Della Chiai's past begin to be drawn together with those of the violent present. For there is strong evidence that the lessons he had learnt in Spain and Italy, and which had been reinforced in Chile, were to be applied practically in Central America. The next step would be Bolivia. In El Salvador, the aspiring nationalist politician Major Roberto Dabuisson listened enthusiastically to Della Chiai's account of the men and expertise he could provide. He invited him to contribute his views on how the Salvadorian army should cope with guerrillas and subversives, and Della Chiai responded with a paper written in his inimitable leaden style. The document, signed with Della Chiai's code name Alpha, was included in a June 1980 analysis of the Salvadorian military from their private files of a group working closely with Dabuisson. It is clear, on reading it, that Della Chiai's views had not changed. The battle should still, he argued, be fought outside the normal conventions. And then they quote from the document, "The military operations of the armed forces now are more effective, and they are attacking the neurological points of the enemy, destroying important sections of their organizational structure. Finally, the Salvadorian army is making battle outside the framework of conventional war.
Continuing. Dela Quilla returned, full of enthusiasm, from El Salvador to Buenos Aires, where he gradually convinced the Argentine military that he really did have something to offer. His most obvious asset was his ability, through his European network, to monitor the activities of exiled opponents of the Argentine regime in Spain, France, and Italy. He and Pagliai began traveling to Europe in pursuit of their duties. They held Argentine passports and were paid by the Argentine military in dollars. Soon they were performing a similar service in Nicaragua and El Salvador, transmitting information back to Buenos Aires on left-wing exiles and passing on arms, equipment, and finally men for the Salvadorian death squads. Dela Quilla was an efficient recruiter of European labor. He telephoned his unemployed friends in France, Germany, Italy, and Spain and negotiated trial contracts which rarely paid less than $1,500 a month. Towards the end of 1979, Argentina's military leaders began to look anxiously at the deteriorating political situation across their northern border in Bolivia. Argentina was just emerging from its devastating internal, quote, dirty war in which up to 30,000 people had disappeared. And the military leadership was deeply concerned about Bolivia's trend to the left, a trend which could easily cross the border and refuel resistance to the military in Argentina. An Argentine intelligence officer, Major Hugo Raúl Miore Pereira, whom Dela Quilla had gotten to know well during his time in Central America, was appointed by the military high command in Buenos Aires to maintain close liaison with right-wing Bolivian officers. It was in Miore's fashionable apartment on the Avenue Libertador, It was in Miore's fashionable apartment on the Avenue Libertador in Buenos Aires that Dela Quilla first came into contact with a series of prominent Bolivians, including General Hugo Banzer. As a result of those meetings in late 1979, Dela Quilla and Pagliai, traveling in the disguise of the Argentine officers Moduño and Bononi, moved discreetly to Bolivia via Central America. They had come to offer their support in mounting the military coup, which Klaus Barbie and his friends were by now actively preparing. The arrival of Dela Quilla in Bolivia marked the beginning of a new and ruthless phase in the run-up to the coup.
Dela Quilla was now 44, his enthusiasm for the cause undimmed by his many setbacks. He saw the Bolivian crisis as an essential part of a right-wing movement which he hoped would roll back communism and left-wing governments everywhere in South America. Quoting Dela Quilla, "I decided that I had to contribute to the creation of an international revolutionary movement," he told a Spanish magazine interviewer in early 1983. "I was thinking then, as I think now, that it is not possible to carry forward revolutionary action in one country without a global vision of political events and a common strategy. So when the proposal of a national revolution presented itself in Bolivia, we were there, collaborating with our Bolivian comrades. We were neither torturers nor drug terrorists, but political militants." I would interject, take that last statement with a monstrous dose of salt. Also bear in mind this global vision of, quote, revolution that he talks about with Kruger's analysis of the International Fascista, of which Dela Quilla was a key part. Despite this continuing here with the Nazi legacy, despite this high-sounding language, Dela Quilla was there to do an essentially practical job. Arce Gomez placed him in Department 2 to work alongside Klaus Barbie. Barbie was 67, hardened, and cynical. For him, the coup would be primarily an act of self-preservation, though he could argue the case against communism with the best of them. But he admired Dela Quilla's inflexible approach. It struck a deep chord in his old SS heart. It was not the first time the two men had met. Alvaro de Castro, Barbie's shadow and bodyguard, recalled a trip Dela Quilla made to Bolivia in 1978. Quote, "He came to Bolivia from Argentina with Pagliai," he said. "I met them with some others to discuss the possibility of publishing a magazine in La Paz." The two Italians held long discussions with Barbie and de Castro. The bond then struck between them was to last. Quote, "They were good people," said de Castro disingenuously. "We liked them," unquote. What Barbie was able to offer Dela Quilla when he arrived in November of 1979 was unrivaled local knowledge. He could explain the intricacies of Bolivian politics, the strengths and weaknesses of the security apparatus, and the importance of the drug mafia. Delaquiai was impressed to find that the kind of paramilitary squad he had always used himself was already in existence, organized by Barbie. He set about organizing his own to supplement it. The hit squad assembled by Delaquiai in Bolivia, like the Fiancés of Death, was an unsavory collection of neo-fascist mercenaries. In Delaquiai's case, however, they were mostly Argentines and Italians. He called them, with a characteristic touch of melodrama, the Phoenix Commando.
The reality scarcely matched the hyperbole. Among the civilians, Mario Mingola was a fairly standard case. An Argentine who had tried at one time or another every religion, from training for the Catholic priesthood to joining the South Korean-based cult of the Moonies, interspersed with clandestine operations in Central America, Mingola had finally opted for neo-fascism in Bolivia. By the way, it's rather interesting that Mingola, this particular man they're talking about, happened to have joined the Moonies, as we will talk about a little later. Mingola had finally opted for neo-fascism in Bolivia. Quote, "We identified 16 international terrorists in Bolivia at this time," unquote, said a U.S. intelligence official. Most of them had been brought in via Argentina. The presence of these bizarre foreigners did not go entirely unnoticed in La Paz. José Fajardo, an eccentric Uruguayan bookseller living in the Bolivian capital, was sufficiently alarmed to attempt to infiltrate the group around Klaus Barbie in order to find out more about them. He then made strenuous efforts to warn both the Bolivian press and trade unions about them. Quote, "But they thought it was all too fantastic," he said, "and they never listened. I tried to get messages to Europe through visiting tourists, but it was like putting messages in a bottle." Fajardo described the relationship between the very different members of the group. Barbie was the moral authority, a sort of oracle and ideological director. He gave them advice and contacts, and he helped them organize their false documents. He was always careful not to be in the forefront of the action. Carbone was important for the international connections. He was a coward, though. They once gave him a rifle to hold, and he could hardly stop trembling. Delaquiai was the other ideological guide and a great organizer. He was a poor physical specimen, but very brave. His lieutenant, Paliai, was a real man of action. Bolivia, according to Fajardo, was attracted to the group for several reasons. Quote, "They had tremendous contempt for the Bolivians themselves, for racial reasons. They regarded them as something akin to the missing link, and they certainly didn't think they could build a race of supermen here. But it gave them a refuge when they were on the run. They could count on the corruption of the military officers. It was easy to get papers and easy to influence the fascists in the military."
In a bizarre echo of Che Guevara's analysis, they also saw Bolivia as a strategic location. If they did not stop communism there, they argued, it would spread throughout the continent. The Argentine military dictatorship provided essential backup, supplementing the Bolivian credentials supplied by Barbie with Argentine army papers. They also increased their military mission in La Paz to 70, including in their number several notorious veterans of Argentina's dirty war. As Bolivia limped from crisis to crisis in the early months of 1980, Delaquiai and Barbie worked intensively together. Over the next few months, the two men, holding regular discussions with Garcia Meza, Arce Gomez, and their military cronies, put together the essential ingredients for a military coup that would serve their common purpose, the restoration of a dictatorship in the fascist mold. A new element of terror was proposed by Delaquiai as part of the buildup. It was one he had learned in Argentina. Key opposition figures must be picked off early. They should either be murdered or kidnapped, always using unmarked vehicles. To avoid the hostility against a new regime that actions like this might attract, the work should be done not by uniformed soldiers, but by unofficial, unquote, elements, hooded paramilitary gangs. The Bolivians were not entirely convinced about this. There were diverging views about the form and degree of repression both before and after the coup, said a former associate of Delaquiai. Delaquiai argued that the enemy had to be completely beheaded, which meant the elimination of Hernan Siles Zuazo, Juan Lequin, the trade union leader, and the rest of the leaders of the political opposition. The Bolivians, on the whole, hoped for a less drastic solution. Delaquiai seems to have won at least some of the arguments. In February 1980, the office of the left-wing newspaper Aquí, a persistent critic of the involvement of prominent Bolivians in the cocaine trade, was destroyed by a bomb. In March, its editor, Luis Espinal, a Jesuit priest, was kidnapped and tortured to death by a paramilitary squad, acting, it emerged later, under orders from Department 2. As rumors of coup preparation circulated, there were conciliatory gestures from the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, General Reyes, towards the powerful trade union organization COB. They signed a pact to respect each other, unquote, and to back the elections planned for June. But by May, there were ominous signs of dissent. Garcia Meza, who had been promoted head of the army, described the pact, unquote, with COB as no more than a dialogue, unquote. By June, the atmosphere was electric. On June 2nd, Siles Huazo's vice presidential candidate narrowly escaped death when the aircraft on which he was traveling was sabotaged. 4 leaders of the coalition group he represented died in the crash. The plane, it transpired, had been hired from a company owned by Arce Gomez. We're going to take a break at this point and play a little more music. Then we're going to come back, read you about the coup d'etat itself, and then we're going to cover the United States' role in that coup.
Indeed. So we will be back in just a few minutes with more of Radio Free America with Dave Emory and myself, Nip Tuck. Don't go away. We've got it coming up for you right here on KFJC. And with that, we return. This is Nip Tuck with Dave Emory in the studios at KFJC. And for the last home stretch here of Radio Free America for this evening, Drugs, Intelligence, and International Fascism, we're going to go back to the book The Nazi Legacy by Magnus Linklater, Isabel Hilton, and Neil Ascherson. And you'll bear with me. I'm having trouble talking tonight, folks, but we'll try and make this as clear as possible, and we'll explicate some of this stuff near the end of the broadcast, and we've already ID'd, so everything else is copacetic, and we can move on from here. We've been talking about the Bolivian coup d'etat, which is highly significant for a variety of reasons, but not least for which it's one of the purest examples of the drug Nazis in action. Available for scrutiny, and of course Klaus Barbie is supposedly may actually finally go to trial this spring. I will believe it when I see it. So this is also very current news, since it was the fall of the Coca Fascista regime in Bolivia that we're reading about its inception right now. It was the fall of that regime that allowed Klaus Barbie to be in a situation where he could finally be extradited to France to stand trial for his crimes as the Butcher of Lyons when he was the Gestapo commander. Anyway, reading from The Nazi Legacy. They moved on July 17th, 1980. At dawn that day, Bolivians woke to the announcement of a military rising in Trinidad, the capital of the Beni, where mutinying soldiers were calling for Colonel Luis Arce Gomez to, quote, lead a national revolution. The 189th coup in Bolivia's history had begun. As the news came through, an emergency meeting was called in La Paz at the headquarters of the trade union organization COB. Key members of the Committee for the Defense of Democracy assembled, along with trade union and human rights leaders, among them Marcelo Quiroga Santa Cruz, a primary target for the coup leaders. What happened next was a grim demonstration of Dela Chiai's strategy. He was later to boast that the bloody events at the COB headquarters that day were not only supervised by him, but that he took part himself in the killing. According to Ministry of the Interior sources, the plans for the raid and the attacks on radio stations that day had been devised by a small group consisting of Barbie, Dela Chiai, and Paliai, with a Bolivian officer, Guido Benavides, acting as liaison. Those plans had been directed from Department 2 of the Army, but Dela Chiai was later to boast that he took a personal hand in the COB raid. At 10:30 a.m., news reached the COB meeting that the main square in Santa Cruz had been taken by the rebels and that military units in Cochabamba had joined the coup. Quiroga quickly proposed a general strike, a proposition unanimously accepted. As the strike call was being drafted for immediate release to the radio stations, the sound of automatic fire outside interrupted the debate. Inside the COB building, it was at first assumed that the firing was meant simply to intimidate. But this coup was different. As the windows began to shatter, the members realized they were under attack. Noel Vasquez, an official of the COB, remembers what happened then. Quote, "We all hit the floor. Moments later, they burst in, hooded civilians with automatic weapons. They were very ferocious. They ordered us outside. They took the leaders out first, and as we were going downstairs, one of them ordered Marcelo, Quiroga, to stay behind. He refused, but they pushed the others out in front and fired a burst of automatic fire at him. They killed another comrade, too. I saw his body in the angle of the stairs, with Marcelo lying on top of him. I lifted Marcelo's head, and he was still alive but bleeding heavily. Later we heard he was dead." Unquote. What happened next bears all the characteristics of the brutal tactics Delaquiai had been proposing to his Bolivian hosts. The survivors of the COB raid were taken to the headquarters of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where they were beaten and tortured. The women among them were repeatedly raped. From Army headquarters, the group was taken to the offices of the secret police, and a week of torture and beating followed. Quote, "We spent days in a cement cell without food, living in our own excrement," said Vasquez. "We were tortured by hooded paramilitaries with Italian or Argentine accents." As the COB leadership was led captive away, steps were taken to crush the strike. An armed paramilitary squad launched a heavy attack on a Catholic radio station, Radio Fides, and silenced it. Over the next 24 hours, about 20 trade union leaders were to die, while the leaders of the Peasants' Union, Simon Reyes, was so brutally tortured that he never walked again. The strike call was effective only in the mines, where some miners held out for 2 weeks. But with its leaders rounded up or killed, resistance crumbled.
In Santa Cruz, things went equally smoothly. Barbie's lawyer Ustares organized Feeblecorn's gang, now impressively renamed the Special Commando Group, to which he had recently presented an armored car. Quote, "The day of the coup was not very laborious," he said, a former member of the group. "Our job was supposed to be to take the revolutionaries' positions with the assault car. We were destined for important positions, not very bloody ones, and we didn't have to use the assault car," unquote. Ustares' armored car did, however, feature that day. The group took a commemorative photograph in front of it, dressed in battle fatigues and holding automatic weapons. Strung across the car was a banner reading, "Long live Free Bolivia," and prominent in the black row, dressed in battle fatigues, an ammunition belt strapped round his waist and submachine gun in his hand, was Ustares himself. July 17th had gone well for the ringleaders of the coup. By the end of the day in La Paz, the presidential palace and the university were under military control, and every radio station but that of the army was silenced. Outside the capital, the miners' radios continued for a few days until they too were attacked. On July 22nd, the Union leader Juan Lequin, captured in the first assault on COB, went on television to call off further resistance as useless. Garcia Meza, who had supervised the initial rebellion in Trinidad, returned to La Paz for the swearing-in of the junta on July 18th. Sporadic resistance continued, in spite of more than 500 detentions in the first 24 hours, but over the next few days, massive arrests mopped up those who would not manage to reach the security of a foreign embassy or go underground. In operations reminiscent of the Chilean coup of 1973, detainees were herded into sports stadia, from where selected groups were taken out and shot. On July 18th, with the borders closed and the country declared a military zone, the coup had, in the short term at least, been a success. For the citizens, things looked less encouraging. "It became clear who was helping very quickly," recalled one Bolivian. "I was watching television and suddenly found myself watching a string of Argentine soap operas. The shooting was still going on in the streets," unquote. One diplomat said, "Overnight it became the weirdest place imaginable, with creeps with carbines running around and everybody normal off the streets. It was as though the mafia had taken over in downtown Washington," unquote. I would interject, that's a lot closer to the truth, perhaps, than he may have guessed at the time. Continuing with the account in the Nazi legacy. The famous Argentine technique of making people disappear into innocent-looking vehicles was much in evidence. "For a while," said a young Bolivian student, "every time you saw an ambulance, you ran like hell." The exact number who disappeared is unknown, but one estimate put the dead by mid-August at 500 and the wounded at 2,000.
With Garcia Meza installed as president, Arce Gomez became Minister of the Interior and ran the country's security machine. A law of national security was introduced, giving him swinging powers, and he set an unmistakable stamp on the new regime when he announced, quote, "All those who violate the law will have to walk around with their last will and testament under their arm," unquote. Meanwhile, the coup had left the little team in Department 2 in privileged positions. Barbie and the Italians were given command functions in state security under the new Minister of the Interior. Barbie himself with the rank of honorary colonel in the Bolivian army, continued to supervise internal intelligence. Alvaro de Castro was suddenly to be seen at the airport, monitoring the arrival and departure of interesting foreigners. Mario Mingola became an advisor to Department 2 in psychological operations. From his room in the Sheraton, he would indulge his taste for disguise, his passion being to infiltrate potential resistance and report on dissent. Pagliai worked directly under Barbie, specializing in disinformation. Skipping down. Delachiai was assigned the task of winning back some international support. He was quick to show off his new credentials. On September 2nd, he traveled to Buenos Aires for the opening of the 4th Congress of the Latin American Anti-Communist League, accompanied by Garcia Meza's personal delegate. There he arranged several meetings at the Hotel Plaza between Major Dabuisson of El Salvador and senior Bolivians, at which Dabuisson sought and obtained their help in sending weapons and money to his, quote, anti-guerrilla forces. Dabuisson was impressed by the advice he received from Delachiai and his comrades. Quote, "They are professionals," said one Salvadorian who went to Buenos Aires with him. "They can teach the Guardia Nacional how to do things." In October, Delachiai was given an advance of $50,000 with which he traveled to Lausanne in Switzerland to set up the Europe-Bolivia Association, followed later by branches in Paris, Rome, and Madrid. Back in Bolivia, the death squads were in operation, and there was a more or less permanent curfew in La Paz. Barbie, Delachiai, Pagliai, de Castro, and the rest of their associates carried special credentials from the Ministry of the Interior, which permitted them to operate after the curfew hours. If an overzealous Bolivian patrol made a mistake, they quickly paid for it. Jose Fajardo remembered one such incident when Pagliai's brother-in-law was arrested by a Bolivian patrol after curfew hours. He instructed the patrol to drive to the house of the Argentine military attaché, where Pagliai himself came out with a pistol in both hands, and an Argentine behind him with a submachine gun. "Stinking Indians, Bolivian scum," he screamed at them in the authentic tones of the fascist. "How dare you arrest my brother-in-law?" The Bolivians melted away. But there was more than just privileges to enjoy. There was big money. As the internal repression continued, the conspirators moved swiftly to profit from their victory and to bleed the drug business. Quote, "For the first time in history," one U.S. official remarked, "the cocaine trade has bought itself a government." The principle under which Garcia Meza intended to operate was laid down at a meeting in the Ministry of the Interior towards the end of 1980. Klaus Barbie summoned Joachim Fiebelkorn and two of the fiancés of death, Kuhlmann and Koplan, to attend. The minister, he told them, had something important to discuss. Arce Gomez handed Fiebelkorn a list of 140 of the smaller Santa Cruz dealers who were to be, quote, suppressed. None of the 5 big drug barons, including Roberto Suarez, was on the list. Quote, "The generals were no longer satisfied with a percentage of the trade," said one of the fiancés later. Quote, "They wanted to control the business. The government wanted to begin a clear-out of the small and medium-sized pasta dealers so that they could concentrate on the big ones afterward."
This using the government alleged narcotics enforcement, the elements of the government supposedly to control the narcotics trade, was in fact used to eliminate the competition here for the bigger people, and that, of course, is very reminiscent of the great heroin coup as postulated by Henrik Kruger. Continuing. Once again, Barbie was in control of the squad, handing down instructions to Fiebelkorn and reporting back on the activities of the fiancés to Arce Gomez. Increasingly, as the group became more arrogant, he found himself relaying horror stories about their excesses. A monster had been created which would be hard to tame again, but Arce Gomez was untroubled. The monster was making him a great deal of money. Licenses to transport the coca leaf, available only from the Ministry of the Interior, cost $1,500. For a plane to take off unmolested by the authorities could cost $30,000. And of course, there were direct profits to be gleaned from that section of the traffic which Arce Gomez and Garcia Meza controlled directly. There was more than enough for everybody, as a member of the gang remembered. The Garcia Meza regime put us into the money. We transferred our general barracks to a building near the airport, surrounded by trees and a 2-meter cement wall. On the terrace, we installed 2 machine guns. the generals in the government had decided to take the drug traffic into their own hands, going round the dealers and intermediaries. It was a big affair, $2,000 million worth. In November, playing out his public role, Arce Gomez announced publicly that drug trafficking in Bolivia would be punishable by the death penalty under a forthcoming internal security law. More secretly, in the course of another meeting in La Paz, Garcia Meza told the fiancé leadership, quote, "We have to operate in a convincing manner," unquote. The key to Garcia Meza's plan lay in a secret report headed Plan 001-FRGE, an unassuming, plain white document prepared for him by, quote, Special Intelligence Group Number 2 of the Army. It is clear from the criticisms it contains of Department 2 that this remarkable document was prepared by a rival section within Arce Gomez's organization, but some of its warnings about the excesses of the fiancés echo precisely what Barbie had already begun to pass on to the minister. The report began, "Fulfilling your instructions, Colonel Camacho, a senior intelligence officer, put the Special Intelligence Group in touch with the principal exporters of cocaine. The great majority of those interviewed showed great enthusiasm for your Excellency's plan. In order that we might perfect the plan, they facilitated visits for us to several factories that we might observe the various processes and gave us samples of the finished product. The report is a fascinating and detailed account of the business conducted by the major traffickers, the favored and most profitable export routes, the maximum tax that the traffickers would pay in protection money, and the problems the traffickers currently faced. High on the list were the excessive demands for protection money from government officials. These should be controlled," said the report. For the success of the plan, the exporters consider essential to the suppression of individual and workshop production. It is necessary to guarantee the functioning of industrial plants which have a capacity of 5,000 kilos a month. This was the task assigned to the fiancés of death. All the cocaine seized was to be handed over to the Ministry of the Interior. The rest of the confiscated property could be counted spoils of war. And as Joachim Fiebelkorn later testified in the course of his Frankfurt trial, the man who ensured that the special police passes were issued and who ironed out any problems that arose was Klaus Barbie. He was also responsible for paying the fiancés, which he did every month, using a Major Luis Cosio as the go-between. Cosio had once worked for the Drug Suppression Agency, but had switched sides, so he was a useful and knowledgeable intermediary. The leaders of the fiancés returned from their meeting with Garcia Meza in high spirits and threw a party in Santa Cruz. Fiebelkorn was splendid in his SS uniform, recalled one member of the group. The women from the Women's and Mothers National Front gave us flowers. The party ended with shouts of Heil Hitler. So basically, we've seen how the government, basically, as one official put it, the cocaine trade had bought itself a government, and we're now going to take a look at the U.S. government's role in promoting that coup.
And one of the contact points, and a rather interesting one, between the U.S. government and Bolivia was through the filter of the Unification Church of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. Strange stuff, but then again, regular listeners know that strange stuff is what to expect. All of it documented. This is from an article in the Covert Action Information Bulletin. This is bulletin number 25, originally published in, I believe, winter 1986. Covert Action Information Bulletin number 25 from winter of 86. The article itself, the entire article, and I just lost the front page, is called Klaus Barbie, A Killer's Career. It's by Kai Herman, copyright 1984. And this is in the middle of the article after talking about the coup itself and the cries of Heil Hitler as the rightists took power. The first official well-wisher who visited the newly inaugurated President Garcia was a surprise, at least for outsiders. He was the acting leader of the Moonies, Colonel Bo Hee Pak. And for those of you not familiar, it's 3 words, 3 names, B-O-H-I-P-A-K. The representative of the sect's founder, Moon, announced after his return to the U.S., quote, "I have erected a throne for Father Moon in the world's highest city." According to the legally recognized assessment of 4 clergymen from Hessen, a West German state, the Moon sect is a, quote, "criminal union that espouses human psychological terror and proclaims a fascist system," unquote. The Moon sect possesses, among other things, munition factories in South Korea and television channels in South America. They regard their founder, Moon, as, quote, "Holy Father," and President Reagan as the world's, quote, "political savior." A representative of the Moon sect had come to Bolivia at the end of the 1960s. On the 13th floor of the Jazmín building in La Paz, an Asian named Harumiko Iwasawa sat with some Americans, and no one seemed to know what they were actually doing there. It was not until 1983 that the Bolivian Ministry of the Interior and Bolivian journalists determined that the gentlemen from the Moon sect, as well as others, had invested about $4 million into the preparation of the coup. Membership lists of the political Moon organization Causa were found. At the top of the list were the names of almost all the leading military personnel who, at the same time, had been honoring the swastika in Barbie's lodge. Even junta leader Garcia had been converted to the Moonies for a time. Barbie was skeptical of the sect's activities, but had to accept the Moon people as allies. On May 31, 1981, 9 months after the cocaine general's coup, almost the entire leadership of the Moon sect and their Latin American political organization Causa flew to La Paz. Before 200 invited guests in the Sheraton Hotel's Hall of Freedom, Moon's representative Colonel Pack and the Bolivian junta leader Garcia began by praying for U.S. President Reagan, who had been wounded in an assassination attempt. Pack then explained, quote, "God has chosen the Bolivian people in the heart of South America as the ones to conquer communism," unquote. The Moon organization Causa started their political missionary work throughout the entire country. 50,000 of the sect's books, according to a Bolivian intelligence agency report, were brought to La Paz by an American Air Force plane. Let me read that again. The Moon organization Causa started their political missionary work throughout the entire country. 50,000 of the sect's books, according to a Bolivian intelligence agency report, were brought to La Paz by an American Air Force plane. Along with ideological, quote, enlightenment, the education of an anti-communist people's army for a, quote, armed church began. Around 7,000 Bolivians took part in the pre-military training. The Israeli embassy supported the campaign and delivered, among other things, instructional films about the fight against the Palestinian resistance. The leader of the Moon group in Bolivia was Thomas "Tom" Ward. Barbie and the pale American Ward, who always seemed to be absorbed in prayer, were often seen together. Tom Ward was also the man who delivered a payment from the CIA in early 1981 to the Argentinian intelligence lieutenant Alfredo Mingolla, M-I-N-G-O-L-L-A. The $1,500 monthly salary for Mingolla was paid in the Causa office belonging to William Selig, Ward's representative. Selig put less stock in pious attitudes than his boss. He was an electronics specialist with experience in Vietnam and advised the Bolivian intelligence organization on technical matters. The third man in the CIA cadre of the Moonies was Paul Perry, who had already tried to organize a, quote, armed church in Brazil. The Argentinian agent Alfredo Mingolla at first knew little about the connection between the Nazi Barbie and the Moonie Ward. 2 days after his recruitment by the CIA, says Mingolla, he met the old German, unquote, in the courtyard of the Bolivian General Staff. Mingolla came out of Department 7 of the intelligence agency. Barbie came out of Department 3.
Continuing. Barbie greeted his colleague, as Mingolla remembers it. "Hello, comrade. What do I hear? Are you working for a new employer?" Mingolla answered with surprise. "For what? For who, then?" Barbie, "Nah, for Mr. Ward, for example." Mingolla feared reproach. "Yes, doesn't the organization allow that?" Barbie laughed. "It's okay. There has to be cooperation," unquote. Let me read that again. Barbie greeted his colleague, as Mingolla remembers it. "Hello, comrade. What do I hear? Are you working for a new employer?" Mingolla answered with surprise. "For what? For who, then?" Barbie, "Nah, for Mr. Ward, for example." Mingolla feared reproach. "Yes, doesn't the organization allow that?" Barbie laughed. "It's okay. There has to be cooperation." Mingolla says that it was first clear to him on that day that Barbie had become a top man for the CIA, because only top people knew the names of the other agency employees. The Moon Man Tom Ward was Klaus Barbie's CIA contact. The Moon Man Tom Ward was Klaus Barbie's CIA contact man only preceding and directly after the putsch of 1980. Reading that last sentence one more time, because a very, very short sentence, a very, very big meaning. The Moon Man Tom Ward was Klaus Barbie's CIA contact man only preceding and directly after the putsch of 1980. Barbie's steady CIA contact person was the munitions dealer Fernando Incauste. He boasted that he had direct contact with President Reagan, whom he allegedly knew during the latter's California governor days. Another one of Barbie's steady CIA contact people was Jorge Portugal, also a munitions dealer. He was Incauste's close co-worker and Barbie's business friend. The third man from the secret intelligence area with whom Barbie worked was Ludwig Alves Pacheco. The first name, Ludwig, represents his German ancestry, something which Alves Pacheco boasts about. The Bolivian is also proud of his real German passport. He received the passport, he says, for special services rendered to West Germany. With regard to the quality of Barbie's activities as an agent for the American and West German information agencies, even those Bolivian government members who ought to know it best speak about it only hesitantly. The defense minister of the pro-Western government in Bolivia at the time, Manuel Cardenas Malo, in an official interview, cautiously answered our questions regarding information about Barbie's work for foreign agencies. Cardenas, quote, "We have no documentation about it. They let those disappear," unquote, before President Siles took over the government. But that Barbie worked for foreign intelligence agencies is believable. Many people knew that, and there are many people who can confirm that, unquote. Was Barbie merely an informant, or did he, working for foreign agencies, influence the political development? Cardenas, quote, "Many people who work with Barbie are still in service here. You must understand it is dangerous if they find out that foreigners had so much influence here, that they did not just play an advisory role, but that they actually made decisions," unquote. Do you mean to say that the USA staged the 1980 coup? Cardenas hesitates, then answers, quote, "Let me say it like this, and then you can quote me. If there isn't a coup happening today, it is only because the Americans are not interested in a coup." So, I misread that last sentence. If there isn't a coup happening today, it is only because of one reason, because it is the first time that the Americans are not interested in a coup, unquote. So recapping very briefly, because we have some more information to go into, the fiancés of death, acting at the behest of major cocaine traffickers and in cahoots with the government, acting also with the U.S. government, and Klaus Barbie, the head of this organization, who had previously worked for the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps as well as the Galen organization, sets up this brutal coup in 1980. After the coup, the government basically takes over the cocaine trade, Garcia Meza and Arce Gomez cornering most of the proceeds, with the strong-arm help of Klaus Barbie working for the Central Intelligence Agency, and apparently, according to the people on the inside, the United States heavily involved in setting up the coup that brought them to power. Now, this is an interesting situation, and again, the use of the fiancés of death to eliminate competition for the government-allied cocaine traffickers, very reminiscent of Henrik Kruger's scenario in the Great Heroin Coup. And again, bear in mind the triad of U.S. intelligence, international fascism, and the drug trade that's the focus of the broadcast this evening. Now, in the concluding portion, my mouth's getting kind of tired too. In the concluding portion of the broadcast tonight, we're going to take a look at some things sort of bringing some of this information up to date. Although the Contra operation in Nicaragua has gotten the largest amount of publicity, the largest U.S. covert operation is in Afghanistan. The United States is supplying hundreds of millions of dollars every year to the Afghan rebels, and apparently the drug trade, opium and hashish in particular, is heavily involved in the financing of the arms for the Afghan rebels, and a lot of that is winding up in the United States from the so-called Golden Crescent area of Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And we're going to take a look at the postscript of Henrik Kruger's Great Heroin Coup, where in 1980 he was able to pin down and pinpoint some of the key narcotics trafficking elements for of the Afghan rebels.
All right, reading again from The Great Heroin Coup by Henrik Kruger. One needn't be an apologist, Mr. Kruger writes, for Russia's involvement in Afghanistan to see history repeat itself in CIA support for the side financing its operations with opium. By the time the agency admitted supplying arms to Afghanistani insurgent groups, it had long been known that the same groups supported themselves via the drug traffic. As reported a year earlier, quote, feudal landlords whose buildings are threatened with confiscation by the Taraki government are bringing the produce from their poppy crops into Pakistan and used the proceeds to buy rifles, explosives, and other weapons. Pakistani arms merchants report that their new customers come in daily, and business is booming. Guns for drugs, Kruger writes, the same scenario is in Laos, Burma, and Latin America. In a New York Times portrait, Afghanistani rebel leader Syed Ahmed Gailani was described as an aristocrat tied to former King Zahir Shah and the owner of a Peugeot dealership in Kabul. His ancestral holdings confiscated, he was now underwritten by Saudis. Gailani's followers, reports Counter Spy magazine, are for the most part Pathan tribesmen, traditional harvesters of opium. Not long after the major dislocations began, tribal areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan were replacing Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle as the major source of heroin in Western Europe, and beginning to ship heroin to the United States. This was reported prior to the Russian invasion by DEA Director Peter Bensinger. Let me read that part again. Not long after the major dislocations began, tribal areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan were replacing Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle as the major source of heroin in Western Europe, and beginning to ship heroin to the United States. This is reported prior to the Russian invasion by DEA Director Peter Bensinger. He added that the Afghanistani police were vigorously combating the narcotics traffic. Afghanistan's 1979 opium harvest was 20 times Mexico's, thanks to their Russian advisors and the decrease in corruption.
Now, the involvement of the Afghan rebels with the narcotics traffic, and bear in mind that they are the recipients of the largest U.S. covert aid now being provided by the intelligence apparatus, that information can be updated from a number of different sources. We're going to take a look at one right now. Reading now from the New York Times of Wednesday, June 18th, 1986. This is an article entitled Afghan Rebels Victory Garden, Opium. It's by Arthur Bonner. It's dateline Musakala, Afghanistan. Fields of purple, red, and white poppy flowers, contrasting brilliantly with the dull gray of the surrounding deserts, stretched toward the horizon. In one field, where the petals had fallen to the ground, a line of farmers scraped a brownish-black gum from pale green pods about the size of golf balls. They were harvesting opium that, according to dozens of Afghan rebel commanders and fighters, helps finance their war against troops of the Soviet and Afghan armies. The rebels, encountered here and elsewhere on a 1,000-mile journey through 3 southern Afghan provinces, admitted they are involved in poppy cultivation. The war, the rebels said, created its own economic and moral imperatives. They said the opium harvest was crucial to their survival and their continued efforts to oust the communists. Skipping down on the article. In the shade of an ancient tree to the side of a field where the farmers worked in Musakala, an Islamic teacher explained the importance of opium to the rebels. "How else can we get money?" said the teacher, an elderly man named Mohammed Razul, with a thick gray and black beard and large, watery eyes. His brother, Nazim Akhundzada, is regarded by other rebels as the most powerful commander in Helmand province. They said the family has large land holdings that include extensive poppy fields. Quote, "We must grow and sell opium to fight our holy war against the Russian non-believers," Mr. Razul said. Comments like this were heard from dozens of rebels during the journey. Islam does not forbid the harvest, Mr. Razul asserted. Islamic law bans the taking of opium, but there is no prohibition against growing it, he said. The month-long journey with a West German medical team included scenes like this one in poppy fields in every village and town. All the areas were controlled by Afghan rebel commanders and their followers. International anti-narcotics officials in Pakistan say they believe that Afghanistan is the largest single source of illicit opium. American officials estimate that the Afghan crop this year will be 800 metric tons. A State Department report to Congress in February described Afghanistan and the bordering tribal areas of Afghanistan as, quote, "the world's leading source of illicit heroin exports to the United States and Europe." Taking that again. A State Department report to Congress in February described Afghanistan and the bordering tribal areas of Pakistan as, quote, "the world's leading source of illicit heroin exports to the United States and Europe." Ali Ahmad, a rebel commander in his mid-20s, was interviewed amid the ruins of the town of Sangin, about 60 miles northwest of Kandahar. He and his father are the military rulers of the area, with more than 1,000 Afghan rebels under their control. Their family also has extensive farmland. Green poppy pods danced in a light breeze in a field adjacent to his house as Mr. Ahmad discussed the crop with the eagerness of someone who has recently found a way to repair the fortunes of his family farm. Referring to the rebels' increasing involvement in opium harvesting to finance their war effort, he said, quote, "Everyone is taking it up," unquote. Again, bearing in mind the scenario that we looked at in Radio Free America number 24, where the Mayo tribesmen, or Hmong tribesmen in Laos, were growing opium. The harvest was then flown into South Vietnam in partnership with the South Vietnamese government by the CIA. It wound up in the arms of our GIs.
Indeed, and the beat goes on. We will read an article from Monday, June 2nd, 1986's San Francisco Chronicle about some rather interesting packages that have been showing up right here in the Bay Area, just to give you the local angle. The article is headlined, "Bay Area Getting Afghan Hashish with a Rebel Label." The article is by Paul Liberator. Hashish from Afghanistan is arriving in the Bay Area stamped with a political slogan supporting the Afghan guerrillas in their war against the Soviet Union. 1-pound bars of hashish being sold here bear a round gold stamp that says, quote, "Smoke Russia Away." The insignia has a drawing of a semi-automatic rifle in the center and Afghanistan written on the bottom. An agent of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration in Washington confirmed that, quote, "individual," unquote, rebel fighters are producing and exporting hashish to the United States and other countries, apparently to help finance their war effort. Quote, "The best of our knowledge shows that there are individual guerrillas doing it, but not the guerrilla organizations themselves," unquote, he said. The DEA agent said it is difficult to tell the difference between drug dealers and rebels in Afghanistan, and they often may be one and the same. Quote, "Part of the year they are fighters, and part of the year they are farmers," he said. "They don't see it," quote, "producing and selling drugs," meaning, "as doing something wrong. After they sell it, it's someone else's problem." Skipping down in the article. Afghanistan is part of the so-called Golden Crescent that also includes Iran and Pakistan. The region produces more than half of the world's illegal opium. Afghanistan is also a major producer of hashish, a concentrated marijuana product. Afghan rebel leaders say they are opposed to drugs and alcohol because the Quran does not approve of them. They contend that their soldiers do not use drugs themselves because it would violate Islamic teachings and hurt them militarily in their 7-year-old battle against the Russians. Rebel sources admit, however, that heavily armed drug smugglers travel freely over the same trails that they use. Loads of drugs are moved from Afghanistan through Pakistan to Karachi, where they are shipped out with legitimate cargo. Afghan drug dealers do not mind selling to Americans and, quote, "they are happy to sell to the Russians," the DEA agent said. There have been reports that Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan use drugs extensively, selling guns, ammunition, and other goods to buy hashish and heroin. The stamp may be mysterious, but there is little doubt that drug smuggling is helping the rebel cause in Afghanistan. Quote, "Every puff you take is another bit of shrapnel up some Ivan's backside," unquote, one source said. Well, of course, what's entertaining here in a kind of a sick way is the DEA's attempt to maintain that it's the individual rebels that occasionally might happen to, in fact, ship a little bit of drugs here and there back and forth. When, as we've been examining in almost nauseating detail for the past 4 or 5 months, this has been going on forever. As a matter of fact, the United States seems unable to find covert military allies to support who don't seem to be involved in the drug trade, rather than it being a couple of lone wolf drug dealers who just happen to use the same trails as the Mujahideen.
Now, as we mentioned, in May we're going to be doing 3 4-hour programs, Radio Free America programs about the Iran-Contra scandal. The team that in an article I'm about to read you, which is referred to as the secret team, is not only heavily involved in cocaine smuggling in order to finance the Contra operation, but has been involved in a big way with many of the U.S. intelligence narcotics operations over the years. Reading now from the San Francisco, we're going to go into this, by the way, in much more detail in our 3-part series in May. Reading from the San Francisco Examiner of Monday, December 29th of 1986. This is an article by Vince Bielski, B-I-E-L-S-K-I, headlined, "Secret Team Linked with Iran Scandal." Subheaded, "Suit Traces North's Unit to CIA Activities in 60s." A secret team, unquote, of former CIA and military officials and arms dealers was involved in the covert weapons shipments to Iran and the Nicaraguan Contra rebels under the direction of fired White House aide Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, according to an affidavit filed in a Miami lawsuit. Roots of the team date to the secret U.S. war against Cuba in 1961, and its members have since been involved in political assassination programs in Laos, Vietnam, Chile, and now Nicaragua, the affidavit says. The team has also been involved in opium and cocaine trafficking to fund their operations, as the affidavit filed December 15th in a Miami federal court in support of a lawsuit brought by Dan Sheehan, an attorney with the Christic Institute in Washington, D.C. The suit names 29 alleged operatives in the arms network as defendants and alleges that they supplied the explosive used in the May 1984 assassination bid against Contra leader Aiden Pastora in Nicaragua, in which 8 people were killed and Pastora was wounded. The plaintiffs, Martha Honey and Tony Abergan, are U.S. journalists who are seeking damages for injuries they suffered in that bombing. The affidavit is based on information from 79 sources, Sheehan says. The defendants who make up the secret team include former high-ranking CIA officials Theodore Shackley and Thomas Clines, retired Major General Richard Ricord, former CIA agent Rafael Quintero, and arms dealer Albert Hakim of Los Gatos. In the affidavit, Sheehan says he learned of the clandestine group from a former U.S. intelligence officer who worked in Iran, a retired CIA officer, and a former Air Force officer. The intelligence officer discussed, quote, the existence of a secret team of former high-ranking American CIA officials, former high-ranking U.S. military officials, and Middle Eastern arms merchants, who also specialized in the performance of covert political assassinations of communists, and which carried on its own independent American foreign policy regardless of the will of Congress, the President, or the CIA, the affidavit says. The source said the team had been set up in the 70s under the supervision of Shackley and Clines, who were then with the CIA. They joined with Ricord and Hakim and went private, unquote, the affidavit says, after leaving the agency in 1982. Before I continue with the article, bear in mind the statement, the information presented in Henry Kruger's The Great Heroin Coup about these, quote, former operatives. Skipping down on the article, Shackley and Clines worked together at the CIA as early as 1961, after the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, the affidavit says. Shackley, the CIA station chief in Miami, and Clines, his deputy, directed Operation Mongoose, a covert operation of guerrilla raids into Cuba in 1961 through 3, the affidavit says. Exiles involved in the secret war against Cuba have reportedly resurfaced to play a role in the Contra arms network, including Quintero, Felix Rodriguez, and Luis Posada Carrillo. Rodriguez and Posada allegedly operate from Ilopango Air Base in El Salvador, where arms for the Contras are apparently stored and shipped to the Contras. In 1963, several CIA operatives under Shackley's direction were, quote, caught smuggling narcotics into the U.S. from Cuba, the affidavit reads. 2 years later, the operation was shut down, and Shackley and Clines were transferred to Laos, where Shackley was made CIA Deputy Chief of Station, and Clines continued as his deputy, the lawsuit alleges. According to the affidavit, in 1966 through 71, Shackley and Clines directed the Special Operations Group, which trained and used Mayo tribesmen, quote, to secretly assassinate over 100,000 non-combatant village mayors, bookkeepers, clerks, and other civilian bureaucrats in Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand, unquote. That operation was funded by profits from an illegal opium trade run by a Laotian named Vang Pao, this lawsuit alleges. Interrupting, we went into that in great detail in information from Alfred McCoy's The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia in Radio Free America number 24. Continuing. In 1966 and 6 through 68, the affidavit says, the commander of the Special Operations Group was now retired Army General John Singlaub, who has said publicly that he is helping arm the Contras, according to the affidavit. One of Singlaub's deputies at the time, the lawsuit says, was then Marine Corps Major Oliver North. Also involved with Shackley and Clines in the assassination program in Laos was Ricord, then a deputy air wing commander with the Air Force, the affidavit says. In 1971, Shackley and Clines were transferred to the United States, where Shackley became chief of the CIA's operation in the Western Hemisphere, and Clines continued as his deputy. From their new post, they directed the Track 2 operation in Chile, which played a role in the assassination of Chilean President Salvador Allende and the overthrow of the elected Chilean government in 1973, the affidavit reads. In 1974, the two were transferred to Vietnam, where Shackley joined the CIA station, and Kleins was once again his deputy. In 1974 and 75, they directed a project that, quote, carried out the political assassination in Vietnam of some 60,000 village mayors, treasurers, school teachers, and other non-Viet Cong administrators in an attempt to cripple Vietnam's political institutions, the affidavit says. The two funded that operation with POW opium money, according to the affidavit. Because Shackley and Kleins, quote, knew that their secret anti-communist extermination program was going to be shut down in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand in the very near future, they, in 1973, began their own private anti-communist assassination and unconventional warfare program to operate after the end of the Vietnam campaign, the affidavit reads. This was the beginning of the secret team, which 5 years later, in the spring of 1978, would approach Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza with a plan, quote, the objective of which was to carry out the political assassination of the top leadership of the Sandinista revolutionary movement, the affidavit says. By August of 1979, the secret team was supplying the ousted dictator with military weapons for the newly formed Contra forces, the affidavit says. Nip Tuck's now going to read you an article about a specific member of this Contra supply team who links directly with the Kourou-Bosch operations that we read about from the Great Heroin Coup.
Indeed. And this article is from the San Jose Mercury News for Thursday, October 16th, 1986. The headline, Contra figure linked to jet bombing. It's by Tim Golden, Knight Ridder News Service. Dateline Managua. Sandinista security officials said Wednesday that a Cuban exile who allegedly helped run an El Salvador-based Contra supply operation is an escapee from a Venezuelan jail where he was being held for the 1976 bombing of a Cuban jetliner. Deputy Interior Minister Luis Carrion said Sandinista officials are convinced that Ramon Medina, identified by a captured U.S. pilot as the number 2 figure in the Contra supply operation, is in fact Luis Posada Carriles, one of 4 suspects, including Orlando Bosch, charged in the Cubana airliner bombing that claimed 73 lives. Posada Carriles escaped from prison last year. Carrion said at a news conference Wednesday in Managua that Eugene Hasenfuss, the American captured 2 weeks ago, had identified Posada from photographs shown him by interrogators. He also cited other unidentified Sandinista intelligence sources he said indicated that Medina and Posada were the same person. Quote, we are certain that it's him, Carrion said. Skipping down in the article. Posada Carriles was arrested in Venezuela a few weeks after a bomb exploded in the Cubana Airlines DC-8 shortly after it took off from Barbados on October 6, 1976, heading for Havana. A naturalized Venezuelan, Posada had worked for Venezuelan military intelligence. Venezuelan authorities accused Posada and Bosch, a Cuban exile whose case had become a cause célèbre in some exile circles, as, quote, the intellectual authors of the bombing. Posada Carriles escaped August 18, 1985, from a national penitentiary in San Juan de los Morros, 60 miles southwest of Caracas, Venezuela. Venezuela's justice minister told reporters after the escape that Posada had bribed a prison guard supervisor. Venezuelan press accounts put the payoff as high as $25,000, a sum financed, according to unconfirmed Venezuelan reports, by an anti-Castro group. Posada's presence in Central America had been announced over Miami radio stations late last year. Tomás Regalado, general news editor at WQBA radio station, said Posada's associates distributed a taped message from Posada to WQBA and other Spanish-language stations in which he said he had escaped from jail because he expected no justice in Venezuela. Posada also said he was, quote, fighting communism in Central America. Again, as Dave pointed out, a direct connection between the Contras and the Orlando Bosch operation, Kourou, the JM Wave Station in Miami, etc. further proof, if any, was really needed at this point, that basically the whole Contra operation is merely an outcropping of the Bay of Pigs operation. It's just Bay of Pigs Part 6 or something like that, whatever the number would be by now.
And the heavy involvement, as indicated in the article I read before, the one Nip just read, of this same team, Theodore Shackley, the head of JM Wave, where he came directly from Berlin, and this whole team involved, which obviously weaves in a very direct way throughout the entire Radio Free America series we've been doing, and of course, the heavy intersections between this team and the Triple Wilson team. We're going to be going into that and other things in the three-part series in May. One of the U.S. intelligence operations heavily involved in the narcotics and arms traffic that we detailed in Radio Free America number 25 was the Nugan Bank. An article linking the secret team involved in the Iran-Contra scandal with the Nugan Bank appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle of Monday, March 9th, 1987. This is a Chronicle wire service story entitled Aussie Connection to North Probed. Several former military and intelligence officers who helped Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North ship weapons to Iran and Central America were closely associated with the co-founder of an Australian financial concern that collapsed in 1980. Among those linked to the failed Sydney-based concern, Nugan Bank, and its co-founder, Michael J. Hand, was Richard Ricord, a retired Air Force Major General who helped North conduct airlifts of weapons to the Middle East and Central America, according to the 4-year-old Australian investigation. The Australian study, parts of which are still secret, was completed in 1983 by the Commonwealth New South Wales Joint Task Force on Drug Trafficking. The study is receiving scrutiny again in Washington because of the details it contains about activities and movement of weapons around the world by many of the figures involved in the Iran-Contra affair. The Australian report also concluded that several former CIA officials and contract operatives, among them Theodore G. Shackley, Thomas G. Kleins, and Rafael Quintero, were involved in military and intelligence-related activities with Hand and other top officers of the Nugan concern. The Tower Commission report on the Iran-Contra affair and other published reports have linked all of these men to operations in the Middle East and Central America directed by North, the National Security Council aide dismissed in November by President Reagan. Ricord and the other men in the network are the focus of an investigation by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The Australian study, a congressional aide said, provides additional evidence that will help the committee determine whether this group simultaneously functioned over the years as official government intelligence agents while also conducting legal and illegal operations for profit. The Australian study does not demonstrate that Ricord, Shackley, Kleins, or Quintero smuggled weapons or narcotics. It does say, however, that these men were close to Hand, a former Army Green Beret and military intelligence officer who served in Laos during the late 1960s with a CIA-owned airline named Air America. Well, if the Australian study doesn't name it, just about everything else that we've dealt with in this series does. The point being, again, that the team involved in the Iran-Contra scandal goes clear back to the entire milieu of the U.S. national security establishment's heavy involvement with drug smuggling that we have detailed in this and the other 3 previous Radio Free America programs about the CIA and the national security establishment's drug trafficking operations. The next broadcast, Radio Free America number 28, will deal with the LSD trade, the psychedelic subculture of the 1960s, and the heavy, massive involvement of our national security establishment in bringing that about. And we will document that next month. Then we're going to be, in a sense, extending this discussion in May with 3 4-hour programs about Iran-Contragate.
And with that, we're going to wrap it up. But what we are going to do very quickly before we go is we're going to give you a couple of bits of information. First off, sources on a lot of the books. Again, we mentioned we read extensively from The Great Heroin Coup. If you cannot find that in your local used bookstore or in your library, you might contact Tom Davis Books, a service that we mention quite frequently because Tom Davis has an extensive selection of these types of books. And if we ever found another service that had what Tom Davis has, we would tout them too. There's no connection between Tom Davis's company and ourselves, except that we found a lot of useful books there. You can get a hold of a catalog if you write to Tom Davis Books at P.O. Box 1107, Aptos, California, 95001-1107. I'll give that one more time. Tom Davis Books, P.O. Box 1107, Aptos, California, 95001-1107. Okay, and as mentioned, nobody here gets anything out of this one, so that's you're on your own. But he is an excellent source for these kinds of books.
Now, if you cannot locate a source of the great heroin coup, if for some reason Tom Davis is sold out, or if you can't find it about, because it is in other places, libraries, of course, is a very good place to check. The Radio Free America shows, all 26 to date, plus number 27, which will be going down there this week, are available from a tape duplication service, as are our Guns of November shows and a lot of different One Step Beyond shows on permanent file down at this tape service. The name of this tape duplication service is DAVCore, D-A-V-K-O-R-E. They're located at Suite 1300D, as in DAVCore, Space Parkway, 3 words just like it sounds. That's in Mountain View, California, zip code 94043. The phone number is area code 415-969-3030. Write or phone to the attention of Paul. Once again, DAVCore, D-A-V-K-O-R-E, located at Suite 1300D, Space Parkway, Mountain View, California, 94043. Phone number, area code 415-969-3030. Write or phone to the attention of Paul. And again, neither Nip nor myself nor the station makes any money off of this. We have no financial connection with the organization. In fact, I just got done paying a very large bill this past week for some copies they made for me. So,
all right, and with that, we are going to prepare to roll on out the door. We're going to play a song for you that you might find entertaining as we go. We do want to mention that unlike tonight, which was an odd Sunday night for us since it was a Radio Free America, next Sunday will be the usual One Step Beyond show from 8 to 11 o'clock. And probably with time for phone calls and all of those things that make One Step Beyond shows different from Radio Free America shows. I don't know if they make them easier, but they make them different. So don't go away and stick around. There will be music on till 2 o'clock, but first we're going to play a little song that came from an open mic show here up at the radio station, and then we're going to bid you good night. So for Dave Emory and myself, Nip Tuck, thank you for joining us. And thank you for listening to Radio Free America here on KFJC.
This song got us thrown out of the Keystone chain. And I don't know why. We're playing with Jim Carroll, and he can talk about all his friends that died. But I can't talk about this subject. It's near and dear to my heart because of Jerry. Well, I'm a Coke Nazi, goosed up and down my plate. Well, I'm a Coke Nazi. My nose is plastic, so's my brain. I've lost 50 pounds, and that's no lie. I'm doing 3 grams a day, or as much as I can buy. I owe everybody money, but I can always hide, 'cause I'm a Coke Nazi. Can you relate? Look at all those people staring at each other out there. I'm a Coke Nazi. Fill my plate. Well, I'm a Coke Nazi. I always whack it for my friend.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah, I know, Jer. Well, I'm a Coke Nazi. I cheat my mother when I can. When I weigh it, it's always short. And when I wrap it, I always take a snort, 'cause I'm a Coke Nazi. Can you relate? Yeah. I'm a Coke Nazi. Fill my plate. Well, I'm a Coke Nazi. No time to sing, I need a line. Got one, Jer?
Yeah.
Good. Well, I'm a Coke Nazi. I chop all day to make it fine. All right, the finale. I lick the razor, I lick the plate. I like my teeth numb every hour I'm awake. Sing how, Coke Nazi, can you relate? Oh, look at them laughing at each other. Sing how, Coke Nazi, fill my plate. Sing ho, Thank you very much. Jerry and Vice, Heart Attack.
Radio Free. America.